Chapter 801, Coexistence of Danger and Opportunity. Seeing the surprise in Saul's eyes, Byron remembered something and shook his head. The stunning aura with its impactful presence suddenly disappeared. He reverted to that senior with ordinary looks and strange personality. Floco, who had fallen beside Saul's feet due to the teleportation, sat up. Although he wore a cloak, his mermaid tail was too long and protruded from the gaps in the cloak. Saul, your teleportation can actually work without relying on magical elemental particles. You should know that in an environment like Dwarf Valley, even fourth-rank wizards cannot teleport inside. In the future, the tribunal's level of attention toward you will definitely increase another grade. Saul was stunned for a moment. So Dwarf Valley was indeed a place where teleportation was impossible. It seemed the tribunal's coachman had wanted to mock his wishful thinking, but had held back in the end. I accidentally exposed my teleportation method. But it doesn't matter. Even if they discover that my teleportation doesn't rely on magical power, they won't know what I use as coordinates. As for whether they pay attention or not, I definitely won't be able to keep a low profile in the future when setting up new Symphony of Fate arrangements. Thinking this, Saul said to Floco, "It doesn't matter." Then Saul walked to Byron's side. "Senior, the elven aura on you has become even stronger. Was the elven spring water from last time effective?" There was no need to hide it. With Byron's elven aura being so strong just now, Floco, who had once been fifth rank, could definitely recognize it. Moreover, Floco had been fifth rank hundreds of years ago, so his understanding of elves should surpass all of theirs. Floco had been thinking about Saul's teleportation the whole time. Only when Saul ran over to Byron did he remember that Byron had indeed carried the shadow of elves earlier. He leaped up from the ground and sat directly on Byron's experimental table. If not for the mermaid's rather ugly face, that silver-blue large tail would have been quite eye-catching. A mermaid. Byron had never seen a mermaid before. Seeing that tail, he immediately leaned in closer. If not for the fact that this mermaid was brought by Saul, he probably would have wanted to pluck off a scale to study in the next second. However, when he got close, Floco slapped Byron's forehead and pushed him back. Byron was startled, only then noticing that the mermaid before him emanated second-rank magical fluctuations. A second-rank wizard. "Think whatever you want," Floco replied casually. The mermaid's body was barely first-rank level. The soul inside, Kate, was genuinely a second-rank wizard. And Floco, who was temporarily using the mermaid bloodline to seize control of the body, had once been a fifth-rank existence. Even now, in his water spirit form, he could be considered a powerful individual approaching fourth rank. "Rather than studying my strength, you'd better worry about yourself more." Floco turned and flicked his tail, facing Saul across the table. "He's already beginning to show elven transformation characteristics. If this were my era, it would still be a good thing, but now, being targeted by elves is very dangerous." Hearing this, Saul casually conjured a chair to sit across from Byron and took out the large water tank for moistening the mermaid's body from his storage device. "Please elaborate." Floco had long felt this body lacked moisture. Without ceremony, he twisted and leaped directly into the water tank. The splash was very small, as if only a small stone had been dropped in. After barely managing 2 circles in the small water tank, Floco stuck his head out from underwater. "Let me first tell you about the origin of elves, at least the part I know." Hearing that this mermaid actually knew about the origin of elves, Byron no longer dared to view him as experimental material. He quickly sat up straight, as if attending a lecture. Elves are a genderless race. Unlike our Azure Scale clan, they're not born through dual-gender union, but as souls emerging from the well of life. The spring water in the well of life mixed with different fruits or seeds evolves into elven bodies. Such life forms no longer existed in the current wizard world. Saul and Byron exchanged glances but didn't interrupt. Elves of that time were born nearly immortal and ageless. They grew very quickly, then stabilized when their physical condition was at its best. If they truly died one day, they would return to the well of life. But ever since the abyss appeared, the black tide had tremendous effects on the water attribute wells of life. The wells of life became polluted, and the elf spring water that once spread throughout the world gradually disappeared. Elves, who were extremely dependent on elf spring water, also began dying in large numbers for various unknown reasons. Since black tide pollution affected mental strength the most, it was normal for elves to become the first victims after the abyss appeared. Seeing the elven race about to perish, with the world sealed and unable to advance to fifth rank, after the high-rank elves were nearly all dead or wounded, the new king, temporarily pushed forward by the elven race, made a decision no one expected. Saul knew this: abandon physical bodies and exist as pure spiritual entities. Floco nodded, his tail gently paddling in the water tank. Clearly his control over this body was much better than Kate's. They wanted to separate their spiritual bodies and leave this world, not knowing that abandoning the physical body before reaching fifth rank was extremely dangerous. Like shellfish in the sea, shed the shell and only tender meat remains, and everyone wants to eat it. At this point Byron interjected, but from what I know, the elves' spiritual bodies now seem to be trapped somewhere. The place you're talking about should be the world barrier, Floco said. The elves wanted to leave this world, not knowing that the long-starved world consciousness would never let such a large piece of meat go. In the end, the elves were trapped in the world barrier, becoming nourishment for this world. What is world consciousness? Is it also an individual with independent consciousness like us? Saul asked. This might require someone sixth rank or above to truly explain clearly, Floco joked. But even if a sixth rank really explained it to us, we probably wouldn't understand. You can first understand it generally as this world's survival instinct. At this point, Floco beckoned to Byron. Byron didn't hesitate and immediately stepped forward, walking beside the water tank. Floco immediately cupped Byron's face and examined him closely for a while. If one ignored that face which didn't fit Saul's aesthetics, and that upper body which didn't fit human aesthetics, just looking at the tail would make quite a beautiful picture. Finally, Floco released Byron and sighed lightly. You've already begun transforming toward an elf, but because you're not originally an elf and still have elf spring water helping to stabilize your spiritual body, you've been able to survive intact until now. Byron's expression remained unchanged, clearly having already guessed his physical condition. But Saul stood up from his chair. Do you mean there are still dangers ahead? Do we have any protective methods? The Elf King's head was something Saul had given to Byron. If it were someone else, Saul definitely wouldn't care whether this head would bring subsequent troubles. After all, without this head, the beneficiary wouldn't have lived until now anyway. But the other party was Byron, someone who had given him the most fair help during Saul's most difficult times. Now this fairness had transformed into the most solid friendship between them. So Saul was extremely concerned about Byron's physical and spiritual condition. Floco touched his sharp chin. This is also the first time I've encountered such a situation. I can't give you a definite solution. Everything needs to be explored slowly. However, his situation represents both danger and opportunity. One careless move, and he might be pulled into the world barrier by elven consciousness, trapped there forever until becoming a mass of chaotic energy. But if he can connect with elven spiritual bodies without being pulled away by them, then in the future he could possess all the elves' nearly inexhaustible mental power. Chapter 802: Communication Methods with Bone Monsters. If he ignored the dangers brought by elves and only looked at the benefits, Saul would be drooling. Although his own mental strength was abnormally strong among his peers, that was still just among his peers. If he could truly obtain all the elves' mental power, he might be able to increase the symphony of fates binding targets from the previous mere 5 people to hundreds. In that case, as a fourth-rank existence, Saul's fate would be bound to almost all high-rank wizards in this world. Unless the world was completely destroyed all at once, his immortal body would be unbreakable. By then, Saul would also become someone who gathered the fate power of the entire world. Unfortunately, while imagination was beautiful, reality was very cruel. Even if the one undergoing elfification was Saul himself, he had no confidence he could resist the elves' pull. Lord Floco, how can we prevent Byron from being pulled into the world barrier by the elves? Sir, how should I utilize the elves' mental power? Saul and Byron spoke simultaneously, but they asked about completely opposite things. Floco was more familiar with Saul, and the other party was the one who had helped break his seal, so naturally he answered Saul's question first. Stability. Stability of the spiritual body. It can't exceed the limits one can bear, and the spiritual body also can't enter an extremely exhausted, dried-up state. A small sapling will be blown away by strong wind, but a stable, healthy century-old giant tree won't be. As for borrowing the elves' mental power, Floco shook his head. Wait until you become a second-rank wizard. In your current state, don't think about using elven power. Byron could only sit back dejectedly. He only had the possibility of continued advancement after obtaining the elf spring water, but until today, he had just begun attempting advancement. Saul asked Floco for several more points of attention before chatting with Byron about serious matters. I encountered some accidents during my trip and only returned now. How has your progress in the Chaos Realm been? Giving the Chaos Realm compass to Byron and Kelly was mainly to facilitate their study of the inertization formula. Now knowing Byron's condition, Saul could only say the Chaos Realm and inertization formula were too suitable for him. We went 3 times and brought back quite a few experimental materials. We also made contact with your little apprentice. Byron's expression was strange. Anyway, what Noah is doing is quite interesting. Saul also thought of the Death Judge, title Noah had given him, and his mouth twitched with inexplicable embarrassment. Oh right, Noah said that after they stabilized, they started collecting remains of other bone monsters. He also said he wanted to ask you to visit once. It seems he's made some discoveries. Saul only had 3 days to return and handle affairs. Since the Chaos Realm was mentioned, he might as well make a trip. After all, the round trip would take at least a full day. By the way, where's Kelly? Because he had once instructed the two not to separate when going to the Chaos Realm, Saul knew Kelly shouldn't be in the Chaos Realm now. But he'd been here so long, why hadn't she come over yet? Kelly recently advanced to second rank and has been in her room stabilizing her mental power this whole time. This was also the fundamental reason they had only gone to the Chaos Realm 3 times in half a year. With extremely unstable mental power, spatial teleportation wasn't suitable. In that case, let's just go with the few of us. Byron packed up the things in his hands and directly took out the Chaos Realm compass he kept close to his body. Let's go. In the blink of an eye, Saul and Byron landed on the Black Desert. Nearby was Noah's former stronghold. But now that Noah wasn't in the Black Desert long-term, this had become Kelly and Byron's temporary laboratory. The magnificent gate that Noah had built for show still stood beside the laboratory. It now had some real magical formations added to it, probably inscribed by either Byron or Kelly. Saul first followed Byron around their laboratory, then brought Floco underground to visit the bone lizard monster he had captured. Saul's original intention was to ask if Floco had any understanding of these bone monsters that appeared at the end of the black tide. However, the moment Floco saw the bone monster, he was immediately shocked. There's almost no magical power here. How could undead clan monsters appear? Saul frowned. This monster is completely different from undead clan records in books, and it doesn't understand undead whispers either. Undead whispers was one of the commonly used magical languages in the wizard world, evolved from the undead clan's language. When Saul had tried communicating with the bone monster, he had used several languages he knew, but the other party couldn't understand any of them, so he could only use force. Floco observed the bone monster before him again. It had been in a sleeping state ever since Saul sealed it. But Floco was also very careful when approaching, seeming reluctant to touch the other party. This is indeed quite different from the previous undead clan. Looking at the characteristics on its body, I believe it underwent fundamental mutation after being polluted by the black tide. However, if we go by the previous racial characteristic definitions of the undead clan, it could still be considered a new type of undead and classified within the undead clan. Saul nodded in understanding. So they're not the original undead clan, which is why it couldn't understand when I used undead whispers. But Floco shook his head. If you really used current undead whispers to communicate with historical undead clan members, they wouldn't understand either. He smiled. Besides textual evolution caused by the times, it's more because the undead clan, especially lower undead, don't communicate through language. Their bodies come from rotting earth and can't support overly complex, delicate movements, so communication relies more on direct mental transmission. Direct mental transmission of information is delicate work. Saul didn't disbelieve Floco, but direct mental communication required very high control over mental power. To achieve this, one would need to be at least a second-rank wizard. The undead clan couldn't possibly have even their lowest skeleton frames be second-rank existences, right? That would be too terrifying. Even more exaggerated than elves. Only higher undead need precise communication. Lower ones lack sufficient intelligence. They're only responsible for receiving simple commands. Hearing this, Saul looked thoughtful. So do you think this bone lizard can receive mentally transmitted signals? Floco wasn't very optimistic. Although it's large, it doesn't have many fine structures and looks like just a powerful enforcer. I estimate it can understand some things, but execution might need a discount. Despite Floco's pessimism about communication prospects, Saul was still somewhat tempted. This bone monster could be considered top-tier combat power in this world, with abnormally scarce magical power. If he hadn't mistakenly entered this world, the bone lizard wouldn't have been sealed here. But then again, without his appearance, this massive skeleton would probably still be sleeping underground. Saul directly sent Floco back to the surface, then returned alone to the underground seal. Standing before the massive bone lizard, Saul's skin disappeared like water drops into a desert. A black skeleton appeared. The bone lizard that had been sleeping across from him shook its head and slowly raised it up. Chapter 803, Bone-Flying Lizard. Floco knew that Saul deliberately sending him up meant he wanted to conduct some private experiments. He didn't expose this and turned to talk with Byron, who was sitting in the crude laboratory with a serious expression, still studying his notes. This chaos realm, is it the continent that was devoured by the abyssal eye? Byron shook his head and honestly answered, I don't know. Floco sighed. He just felt that the nearly magic-free environment here, combined with the inertized pollution sources overflowing from the earth, couldn't help but remind him of a certain continent that had already disappeared from the wizard world. If he hadn't been sealed in the deep sea before, forced to remain here, he probably wouldn't know that this world had become like this. But thinking carefully, in the vast universe, how many worlds completely perish in silence? Byron saw Floco's contemplative appearance and suddenly felt this strange mermaid had gained some sense of reality. He walked over and asked Floco for guidance. "Lord Floco, I still want to ask you, how should I utilize the elven clan's mental power?" Mentioning elves, Floco also lost the mood to continue lamenting and said with a smile, "I can teach you, but you also need to provide something in return." Byron nodded. "That's appropriate. What do you need?" "After you can actively extract elven mental power, I want a portion too." Byron said very seriously, "I have no problem with that, but aren't you afraid of pollution?" Floco chuckled lightly. "I can even break through stargates. Would I fear elves stuck in world barriers?" This statement had some boastful elements. If it were his peak strength period before, he indeed wouldn't be afraid, but now, he only dared to want a small portion. After all, the water god's current state wasn't much better than the elves'. However, to quickly recover strength and leave before this world was swallowed by the abyssal eye, he still needed to take some risks. Saul probably wasn't yet clear that this former fifth rank he had rescued with the Symphony of Fate wasn't optimistic about this world's future. But even if Saul knew, he wouldn't regret rescuing this former fifth rank. Besides helping Saul escape from Ophelia, he was also a good candidate who could provide considerable fate power. Byron didn't know that Floco before him was a former fifth rank, but from information received from Saul, he knew the person before him was at least equivalent to a third-rank wizard. Otherwise, ordinary wizards wouldn't even know the concept of stargates. Then the deal. Although guessing the other party was at least third rank, Byron spoke in the same manner as usual. While Floco was teaching Byron knowledge about stabilizing spiritual bodies and using mental power, the ground suddenly shook. The two immediately stopped communicating and left the crude laboratory. The Chaos Realm lacked elemental particles. If unnecessary, Byron wouldn't waste his magical power. And Floco even less so. He was currently using just an ordinary mermaid's body and had nothing to use even if he wanted to. The two ran out of the laboratory, wanting to see what had happened, and also fearing the laboratory would collapse and bury them. Fortunately, they ran out. Just as they stepped onto the black desert, a massive depression appeared not far from the laboratory. Black sand and stones cascaded down along the depression. Then the center suddenly bulged into a mound. The mound grew larger and larger, with sand falling from it like a waterfall. As time passed, the entity beneath the mound gradually revealed its true form. It was a massive lizard skeleton, with a pair of white bone wings attached. Black sand and stones fell from the white skeleton, stirring up gray-black dust. For a moment, black and white intertwined with magnificent momentum, giving the sense of a big boss making an entrance, just missing background music. When the bone monster completely broke free from the black desert, Byron and Floco, who were looking up, saw a black figure in front of the monster's bone wings. The figure was entirely wrapped in a black cloak, even wearing a black mask with a metallic luster on his face. He rode the massive bone lizard with a steady posture, completely unconcerned about the fierce monster beneath him. Although his appearance couldn't be seen clearly, the magical fluctuations emanating from him were very familiar. Byron raised his hand to shade his eyes. Where did Saul go? Floco stared blankly at the bone monster that suddenly took off and disappeared into the sunlight. This guy's mental power is somewhat abnormal. Byron nodded very agreeably beside him. Yes. Floco looked at Byron speechlessly, very much doubting that this guy completely didn't understand why he called it abnormal. But who told this straightforward fellow to have a world of elves behind him? Floco flicked Byron with his tail. Let's go back and continue. Oh, and get me a tank of water. There. Saul transformed into a black skeleton, riding the massive bone lizard and soaring through the high sky. Although he could also fly himself, even faster than the bone monster beneath him, the feeling was different. Riding this bone monster didn't require Saul to consume magical power. Moreover, the bone lizard plus a pair of bone wings looked just like a bone dragon. Dragon Knight. Saul patted the bone monster beneath him. The other party could only execute simple commands. Perhaps because Saul could transmit some complex information through mental power, the bone lizard directly treated Saul as a high-rank undead and began following Saul's commands without resistance. It just truly had no brains. Saul told it to follow the passage and emerge from underground, but the bone lizard instead took off right where it was, almost overturning the crude laboratory above. Fortunately, the general direction was correct. Saul glanced at the two people on the ground, released magical fluctuations to reassure them, then rode the bone lizard toward the boulder tribe where Noah was located. During flight, cold wind howled. Saul looked at the bone monster beneath him, feeling it was much more impressive than riding the giant bird Diu-Diu. The giant bird Diu-Diu was a mount Pear had given Saul, with an image leaning more toward cute. But this bone lizard was different. Whether its massive size or flying posture, everything was incredibly cool. From now on I'll call you Bone Flying Lizard. Saul casually gave it a name. The bone flying lizard had no reaction, unclear whether it accepted this name or simply didn't understand. After flying for over an hour, Saul saw the Boulder tribe stationed at the edge of the Black Desert. In just half a year, under Noah's strong leadership, and with resource supply from Byron and Kelly, the Boulder tribe had evolved from a small, semi-underground tribe into a town of considerable scale. Stone walls were built around the city perimeter, with bows, arrows, and giant slingshots on top. The city center had small houses. Though arranged chaotically without planning, there were at least several hundred, looking quite spectacular. In the very center of the city stood a crude tower nearly 10 meters tall. From its appearance, it seemed to be imitating a wizard tower. Without thinking, Noah must be here. Saul had the bone flying lizard land on flat ground outside the city. He didn't dare let the bone flying lizard land inside the city. If the brakes failed, Noah's crude town, built with great effort over half a year, would truly return to pre-liberation times overnight. Chapter 804, Noah's Ambition. Although the bone-flying lizard didn't enter Boulder City, it still terrified the soldiers guarding the city. Most of these people had never seen the bone-flying lizard, but the shocking legend of its single ground strike completely destroying the entire forces of two tribes had already spread throughout the desert. The ignorant people of the Chaos Realm feared it even more than the death judge that Noah mentioned. This was because they couldn't comprehend the death judge's power, but the bone-flying lizard's strength had been witnessed firsthand by many. It had become countless people's nightmare. So when the bone-flying lizard landed on the wasteland 500 meters from the city gate, soldiers immediately ran to report the news to the city lord and high priest living in the Black Stone Tower. However, they didn't know that a figure had already appeared before their city lord and high priest before the soldiers even jumped down from the city wall. Saul teleported directly behind Noah. At this moment, Noah was resting on a long chair covered with animal fur. On the other side of the room, behind a long table, the former ordinary youth Scorpion was looking at the text on a sand table with distress. Why do I have to relearn every single character? Scorpion lay sprawled on the table. The clothes he wore now were much more refined than before, and he had a brown cloak made of giant feathers draped over his back. Because he was now the clan leader of the entire Boulder tribe, and also the lord of Boulder City. After witnessing the power of Saul and the bone monsters, the original clan leader didn't hesitate much and announced the next day that he would transfer the clan leader position to Scorpion. He didn't give it to Noah because the latter had clearly stated that he would serve the Death Judge for life and wouldn't take on any tribal leadership position. The old clan leader was also relieved by this. He didn't want to pass the clan leader position to an outsider in his heart. Scorpion, who had the best relationship with Noah, was directly stunned when this enormous fortune fell on his head. Originally, due to his insufficient physical mutations, he had always been a marginal figure in the tribe. But because he brought back Noah and had a good relationship with him, he directly became the new clan leader. When Boulder City was established, Noah even directly supported Scorpion as the Lord of Boulder City. However, being a city lord wasn't as fun as Scorpion had imagined. Not only did he have to worry about Boulder City's affairs every day, but he also had to squeeze out time to study. Learning writing, arithmetic, martial arts, and management. Scorpion, who had just recovered, was once again overwhelmed by heavy tasks. He even wanted to give up his city lord position. But Noah told Scorpion that once he was no longer the city lord, he would likely die an unnatural death in a short time. This scared Scorpion so much that he never dared mention abdication again. Though he stopped talking about abdication, his daily complaints never decreased. "Noah, can't you be like Lord Death Judge and just wave your hand to make me learn all the characters?" Scorpion was currently learning the Common Language, which had far more characters and complex grammar than the pictographic writing used in the Chaos Realm. Stop thinking about taking shortcuts all the time. Learning is also a process of improvement. Otherwise, when Boulder City's scale continues to expand and you can't competently fulfill the city lord position, you'll eventually be eliminated. Scorpion's eyes rolled. Having spent considerable time with Noah, he was no longer as fearful of him as before. Moreover, he had seen Noah's embarrassed side and didn't admire him as much as the other tribespeople. He tentatively asked, "If I really can't be city lord, could I become an elder?" His predecessor was now an elder of Boulder City, had nothing to do every day, was especially respected, and received considerable offerings. Scorpion was quite envious watching him now. Who knew that after hearing Scorpion's question, Noah would rise from the reclining chair, the corners of his mouth curving up as he looked over coldly. "You are someone blessed by the Death Judge. You cannot abdicate due to inability to fulfill the city lord duties. You can only die in war or sacrifice yourself for Boulder City." Hearing Noah's explanation, Scorpion froze in place. After a full minute, he suddenly lowered his head to look at those complex characters. Watching this scene, Saul silently sighed. Although Noah was only in his teens due to his early experiences, his mentality was already different from ordinary people. Conversely, Scorpion, who was taller and older than Noah, still had a laid-back attitude. Saul raised his hand and directly sealed Scorpion's consciousness, then revealed his form and walked to Noah. Seeing Scorpion, who had just shown some panic, suddenly freeze, Noah's heart jumped. Just as he was about to be on guard, he saw Saul appear before him. "Master," Noah stood up joyfully, instantly returning to a childlike, innocent appearance. "Leaving you alone here for so long must not have been easy." Noah came close to Saul. "It's not hard. In fact, I think Master bringing me here was really wonderful. Ever since you told me that my body, due to several failed magical experiments, could no longer adapt to elemental particles in normal environments, I thought I wouldn't live much longer. But you brought me here, not only giving me the possibility to live on, but also teaching me magic and providing me with so many resources. It's no exaggeration to say that you gave me a second life." Saul wasn't fooled by this boy's flattery. He smiled and said directly, "Now that you've established such a force, you won't have to work as hard as before. Noah immediately showed loyalty to Saul. "Master, please rest assured. Whether establishing forces or faith, I'm doing it all for the task you assigned." His eyes brightened. "Oh right, Master, this past year, the teams I sent out finally found a complete bone skeleton that's very similar to the bone monster you rode last time." Saul had already heard from Byron about what Noah had found and wasn't surprised. Bone monsters weren't common, and once awakened could be very dangerous. Saul still couldn't confirm that what Noah found was definitely a mutated undead clan skeleton. That's why he was so eager to come to Boulder City to confirm. "Where is it? Take me to see it." "Yes, Master, please follow me." Noah immediately led Saul outside. "The skeleton we found this time is relatively small, can't compare to the one you rode, but it's still about a meter in size. I was afraid there might be dangers we couldn't handle and worried about others tampering with it. So I stored it separately on the top floor of Boulder Tower, where normally no one else can access it." Saul nodded, finding Noah's caution to his liking. Just as Noah walked ahead and opened the door, a tall, sturdy man with bull horns on his head suddenly rushed up the corridor. This strong Chaos Realm person currently had a panicked expression. Upon seeing Noah emerge from the room, he immediately reported loudly, "High Priest, sir, trouble. The bone monster that appeared half a year ago has appeared again. It landed not far outside the city." Noah immediately looked back at Saul but saw him expressionless, giving no indication. At the same time, Noah keenly noticed that the reporting soldier only stared at him, with his gaze never shifting to Saul beside him. He immediately realized Saul was deliberately concealing his form. So he didn't expose Saul's presence either, just sternly shouted, "What's there to panic about? That's the Death Judge's mount. It's perfectly normal for it to occasionally appear at Boulder City. You should immediately show respectful salutes. Pass down the order. From now on, whenever anyone sees the Death Judge's mount, everyone must immediately stop what they're doing and perform the highest etiquette." Chapter 805, Anne's New Job. Noah easily dismissed the panicked soldier, then turned and respectfully led Saul upstairs. Saul watched the boy before him, whose expression and demeanor changed effortlessly, sighing inwardly at how much his little apprentice had changed. But how many people in this world could maintain their original intentions after experiencing countless trials? He had no right to judge Noah. Saul followed Noah to the top floor of the Boulder Tower. Due to backward construction techniques, the top floor was only a space less than 2 meters high with sloped surfaces on all 4 sides, making it appear even more cramped. This room contained only one box with a wooden lid on top and a magical tool placed in the center of the lid. This tool was something Saul had previously given to Noah. It was a type of magical tool with automatic defensive capabilities. Not very powerful, but low on energy consumption and not complex to make, making it very popular among wizard apprentices. Without Noah's introduction, Saul already knew that the box contained what they had found. He stepped forward and lifted off the defensive magical tool, which became as quiet and obedient as a rabbit. A freshly roasted one at that. Saul lifted the lid and looked down at what was inside the box. It was a bone fish. The fish body was a meter long, with the head taking up almost a third of the body. The teeth in the fish's mouth were abnormally sharp and long. Even when the mouth was closed, these fierce teeth still protruded from it. But no matter how terrifying its appearance, this fish probably couldn't fight like the bone-flying lizard. Well, although it's smaller in size, at least it's another complete experimental subject. Better than pulling teeth from the bone-flying lizard. Saul raised his hand and directly put the bone fish before him into his storage device. Noah complained from behind, "Master, you don't know, to find bone monsters, the Boulder tribe went deep underground and into the desert. In half a year, dozens of people died, and there are still dozens more out there continuing to explore. Saul turned back with amusement. Just say it directly, what do you want? Noah grinned, staring at Saul with wide eyes. Master, could I have some of little algae's branches? Little algae. Saul froze. He hadn't gone to see little algae since returning and didn't know if it had awakened. After going back, he definitely needed to check on little algae's condition. Although the Wizard Tower's people were helping to care for little algae, he still needed to see for himself to feel at ease. But given little algae's current state, it definitely wasn't something Noah could control. One careless move and it might devour everyone in Boulder City. Little algae won't work. Little algae is also a demonic creature. This environment isn't suitable for it. Noah opened his mouth. Saul knew he wanted to explain that he only wanted a branch. Branches aren't suitable either. Little algae's current state isn't stable, and in this environment it might mutate. Noah immediately closed his mouth. He wanted to borrow the powerful little algae as Boulder City's guardian beast, but didn't want to be accidentally killed by his own people. It's just that now Boulder City's influence was growing, inevitably attracting the covetousness of other forces. Although he had quite a few magical tools, they were basically all apprentice level. Wizard apprentices hadn't yet transcended the ordinary. When facing powerful individuals, they might end up in mutual destruction. So Noah urgently needed a powerful and obedient trump card. Initially, he had set his sights on his teacher's little algae because it was both adorable and obedient. But now it seemed that wouldn't work. Noah looked at Saul hopefully, clearly wanting Saul to help him think of a solution. Fine, considering you found a complete bone monster, I'll find you a bodyguard and enforcer. No matter what Noah had accomplished in this world, he was working hard to complete the task Saul had assigned. Saul opened the diary in his spiritual body. Anne, would you be willing to stay in the Chaos Realm to help Noah expand his territory? Anne showed no hesitation. My master, you need not ask if I'm willing. As long as I can help you, I'll do anything. Saul knew Anne's words carried no discount, just like how she had previously volunteered to stay in the diary, ready to sacrifice herself to help Saul at any time, learning from Senior Morden. After finding her enemy at the inverted tree and personally devouring the enemy's soul, Anne had shown a passive attitude. Not passive towards Saul, but unlike others, she didn't thirst for power or new knowledge. Moreover, Saul's strength had now surpassed most souls in the diary, so they could only assist him and rarely play key roles. Therefore, when Saul chose to have Anne stay to help Noah, she first felt heavy-hearted, then somewhat happy. Either way, with her near second-rank strength, she would absolutely be ceiling-level combat power in the Chaos Realm. Here, she would be more valuable. After receiving Anne's reply, Saul directly extracted Anne's soul entity from the diary in front of Noah. A semi-transparent body appeared between Saul and Noah, gradually writhing and changing into a tall figure with 8 spider legs for the lower half and a beautiful woman's upper half. Anne placed one hand on her hip, looking down at Noah condescendingly. Little guy, would you like Big Sister to stay and protect you? Noah gulped. He really still wanted little algae, powerful, and most importantly, adorably obedient. Noah finally, happily accepted Anne's protection. Saul directly extracted a large amount of soul fragments from his body to give to Anne. Pure soul fragments filtered through him were more important to Anne than magic crystals. They were an important way for her to replenish energy. After solving Noah's problem, Saul silently returned to the bone-flying lizard and flew away from Boulder City. Throughout the entire process, aside from Noah and Anne, no one knew he had been there. This was also to cooperate with Noah's God-making plan. Since he was a god, How could he frequently appear before ordinary people? After returning from Boulder City to the temporary laboratory, Saul saw water god Floco instructing Byron. He jumped down from the bone-flying lizard, landing near the two. Lord Floco, would you like to stay at the Purity Wizard Tower next? Floco understood elves the most and could help Byron. However, Floco shook his head in refusal. My consciousness can't stay in this body much longer either. My current state isn't stable yet. If I stay here too long, problems will arise on Mina's side, exposing her relationship with me. After helping Saul intercept Ophelia, Floco had been hiding beside Mina, continuing to recover his strength. After breaking the seal, he could transform himself into a water spirit, randomly hiding in Mina's water cup or even in Mina's blood without being discovered. It could be said that, when advancing to 5th rank, Floco had already completely transformed himself into a water elemental being. This was something Ophelia could never achieve. At most, the latter could only place her consciousness in different liquids, but her main body was still a flesh and blood wizard. Mentioning Mina, Saul also thought of that lonely yet adorable little girl. He couldn't help asking, "How is Mina doing now?" Floco smiled. "Not bad, stronger than her father. She's already starting to learn magical runes and meditation." Chapter 806, Stay Calm. Mina had already started learning magic. Normally, the optimal age for ordinary people to begin learning magic was between 10 and 18 years old. Starting too early meant unstable mental power and magical potential, which could lead to mutation. Starting too late meant insufficient learning time. If one couldn't advance to 3rd-level apprentice before age 30, they would also face the danger of mutation. But Mina had already accepted Saul's modifications to survive. Saul had treated this little girl very well, expending a 2nd-rank wizard to help her live and improve her aptitude. As long as Mina applied herself somewhat, becoming a 1st-rank true wizard was just a matter of time. Saul asked about the situations of several other acquaintances in Sky City. Whether it was because Saul had been relatively discreet in his interactions with those apprentices, not attracting others' attention, or because Ophelia simply couldn't be bothered with wizard apprentices, Nathan and the others hadn't been affected anyway. They had just been startled by the aerial battle between 4th and 5th rank wizards. After that battle, Sky City had mysteriously calmed down. Even the skyport that had been sealed for nearly half a year was completely reopened, allowing normal entry and exit as before. Although there was no evidence, Saul felt this all had something to do with Kismet. The remaining time was spent waiting for the Chaos Realm compass to cool down. During this period, Floco mainly explained to Byron how to better utilize mental power. Sometimes he would use himself as an example. Thinking of Floco's water spirit state, Saul interjected with a question. "Lord Floco, in your era, many people called themselves gods. What's the difference between gods and the current 4th and 5th ranks? Does faith power really exist as energy?" Hearing Saul's question, Byron's eyes widened as he finally realized that Floco before him might be more than just 3rd rank. Floco didn't immediately answer Saul, but after thinking for a moment said, "I don't know if other worlds beyond Stargates have faith power, but the current wizard world probably doesn't." In the Crescent calendar before the Dark Moon calendar, many 4th and 5th rank beings called themselves gods externally, but they were actually more like lords of a faction, similar to current kings or wizards of major forces. The faith they required was actually more of a means to control believers in reverse. This kind of faith could create momentum for them, but couldn't be converted into real power. However, if we broaden the definition, isn't this momentum brought by faith also a kind of power? Additionally, I've heard that some gods could obtain a vague power by expanding bloodlines and influence. To some extent, it could be converted into potential energy, affecting future fortune. This potential energy is invisible and intangible, even harder to define than luck. Yet several fifth ranks personally admitted this potential energy existed, making me have to believe in its existence. Floco's description reminded Saul of a term, fortune or destiny. But there was no way to verify it now. However, there was no rush. Saul had a good experimental opportunity right before him. The Boulder city that Noah had established was completely a force that worshipped Saul. This world was of relatively low level, making it easy to claim godhood. Saul decided to have Anne cooperate with Noah's God-making plan in the future, personally experiencing whether faith could bring fortune. Anyway, Noah calling himself a high priest was definitely preparation for future deification. Saul didn't mind helping him accelerate the process. Time passed bit by bit. The Chaos Realm compass activated again, bringing the three of them back to the Purity Wizard Tower. Just after returning, Floco collapsed to the ground. Then Kate groggily awakened. His control over the mermaid body was still clumsy. He lay on the ground for a long time, unable to get up. He wasn't surprised by his current situation, as Floco should have already explained it to him. "Help, help, water!" Kate flopped on the ground like a fish caught on shore. Saul conjured a large water tank and directly threw the mermaid into it. Kate blew a few bubbles in the water, then sank peacefully to the bottom with a serene expression. Seeing Kate's appearance, Saul knew he was no longer eager to escape the mermaid's body. Saul wanted to go see little Algie and turned to bid farewell to Byron. But when he turned his head, he saw a double image appear on Byron's face. It was like seeing double, making one person appear as two almost overlapping figures. However, that other face didn't resemble Byron and had a different expression. But Saul had seen this face before. The half-elf he had only met once. Yet seeing this face again at this moment didn't make Saul happy. He didn't dislike the half-elf and even admired his generous sacrifice, also grateful for the large amount of magical power he had given at the end. But this didn't mean Saul wanted to see the half-elf on Byron. The scenes previewed in the Golden Pages were still vivid in his memory. After Byron overused his mental power to rescue Saul, he was pulled to their world by those chaotic elves. Now Saul already knew that strange and bizarre world was inside the world barrier. Although Saul hadn't been there, he was certain the interior of the world barrier was 10,000 times more terrifying and dangerous than the interlayer of Gorse's wizard tower. Thinking of all this, Saul said angrily to the double image on Byron, "If you dare take Senior Byron away, even if I have to drill through the world barrier in the future, I'll crush you all to powder." The double image on Byron finally disappeared. Byron had been staring at the mermaid in the water tank. Hearing Saul's words, he was quite surprised. He turned back and patted Saul's shoulder, only saying two words with a smile. "Stay calm." Saul didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and could only leave first. Just as he stepped out the door, he saw a flash of fiery red coming at him. "Saul!" Kelly, who had somehow emerged from the laboratory, crashed into Saul's arms. Like a bull charging at a matador. Saul could only pat Kelly's head. "What are you doing?" Only then did Kelly jump back. "Look, I'm already second rank." Saul nodded. "I can see that." "No, you can't see it. I'll demonstrate for you." Without explanation, Kelly grabbed Saul's hand and dragged him to her laboratory. Halfway there, they encountered Steward Hope, who seemed to have business with Saul. But seeing Kelly holding Saul's hand, he silently stood against the wall, yielding the stairway passage, only bowing and greeting them as they passed. "Good afternoon, Tower Master. Good afternoon, Lady Kelly." Saul only had time to nod at the steward, before being dragged away by Kelly again. Upon reaching Kelly's laboratory, he discovered she had completely renovated it from top to bottom. The previous laboratory had brick and stone walls all around, while Kelly's laboratory was now covered in a deep gray metal on all sides. "Did you create this wall material yourself?" Saul touched it. The texture was slightly rough. "Yes, specifically designed to isolate radiation." Kelly closed the door, deliberately locked it, and activated the magical formation on it. "Now it's time for my performance." Kelly laughed loudly and ran to a sealed cabinet to retrieve a test tube. Saul looked closely. Wasn't that his stored soul fragment polluted by the black tide? What was Kelly planning to perform? Chapter 807, I'll Protect You. "So mysterious," Saul muttered, looking around. "You're not planning to do radiation-related experiments, are you?" Kelly's eyes widened. "Who told you?" Saul spread his hands. "No one told me, but what else could you perform?" Kelly wrinkled her nose. "Well, you still can't guess what I can do." She stopped wasting words, afraid Saul would immediately figure it out. Then Kelly directly opened the test tube in her hand and turned the opening downward. The soul fragment inside slid down along the glass wall bit by bit. It looked like a piece of jelly. When this jelly completely slid out of the test tube, it suddenly accelerated and fell to the ground with a splat. The gray outer shell cracked like pulp, revealing the black pollution source inside. As soon as that small mass of pollution source contacted the outside world, it unceremoniously began expanding and spreading like smoke and mist. The ground quickly gained a black stain. It looked like a human hand, but with only 4 fingers. The pollution on the ground spread relatively slowly, while the smoke in the air expanded rapidly, about to touch Kelly nearby. Just then, Saul suddenly felt Kelly release a peculiar fluctuation. This fluctuation was different from magical power and unlike mental energy waves. Its frequency was denser, with higher amplitude, like densely arranged sharp knives carrying murderous coldness. At the same time, Kelly controlled this fluctuation, emanating it evenly outward and surrounding her body, forming a spiked shell. When the spreading smoke approached the shell, it was immediately pierced by the sharp surface spikes. The originally formed smoke was instantly shattered into tiny particles that fell to the ground. Kelly stepped forward, and the special radiation around her approached the 4-fingered black handprint on the ground. Strangely, that handprint seemed to come alive, moving its 4 fingers and crawling away from Kelly. It had the feeling of fleeing in panic. Kelly didn't let the handprint escape. She strode forward directly and stepped on the fleeing black 4-fingered handprint. Crack! The black handprint, which clearly existed on a flat surface, seemed to be actually stepped on and spread out flat. Not only that, but it also developed many dense cracks. Because Kelly kept stepping on it, the cracks on the handprint became more and more numerous and dense. Finally, the entire black handprint scattered into many fragments with a bang. After doing all this, Kelly turned her head to look over, chin slightly raised, her face full of pride. "How's that? I'm amazing, right?" Saul's expression was serious as he walked forward, bent down to pick up some powder, and rubbed it into even finer black particles between his fingers. "That's right, this is the black powder that forms after black tide inertization. Unless activated by special means, it will maintain this state permanently and lose its contaminating properties." Saul stood up, sighing. "Your radiation attack can actually automatically inertize the black tide, consuming only your magical power. It's much more economical than the inertization formula that Byron and I researched." Kelly habitually rolled her eyes. "What do you mean, consuming only my magical power? My magical power is also very valuable." Saul collected the soul fragment that was writhing alone on the ground. This soul fragment had been away from Saul for an unknown length of time, but when reclaimed, there was no rejection at all. It happily merged into Saul's finger. Kelly watched enviously from the side. Although her radiation attack could already neutralize black tide pollution, Saul's modified body was even more powerful, actually able to preserve it for so long while maintaining the pollution's activity. Seeing Kelly's puffed cheeks, Saul smiled and surrendered. "Very impressive. I don't have that ability." Kelly patted her small chest, half-jokingly saying, "You admit it, right? So from now on I can protect you too." The room was quiet for a few seconds. Looking at Kelly, Saul hesitated slightly but finally said, "Thank you, but you should advance to third rank first." Kelly puffed her cheeks again, but her eyes rolled and she put on a smile, even with some flattery. "Either way, I'm very strong against pollution now. Could you?" Saul saw her hesitating and didn't understand what she was embarrassed to say. "Could you give me a tiny bit of that white stuff? Just a tiny bit." Kelly raised her hand, thumb and index finger almost touching but still leaving a small gap. This emphasized that she really only wanted a tiny bit. Saul was puzzled for half a second, then suddenly understood. But his expression became serious and he immediately shook his head. No. He understood. Kelly wanted fragments of the bone monster he had brought back from the Chaos Realm. But while that thing had no killing power in the Chaos Realm, it had very strong pollution properties after being brought back. Moreover, this property was very similar to the anchor point Saul had obtained from black tide pollution, just that from current experimental results, it wasn't as domineering as the anchor point pollution. After conducting preliminary research with Byron, Saul had immediately sealed the bone monster fragment samples within his own body. He wouldn't let anyone study or use them alone. Currently, only his body, which could withstand black tide storm eyes, could most safely preserve the fragment samples. After coming to the Wizard Tower, Kelly had certainly learned about the terrifying nature of bone fragments from Byron. But she wasn't afraid at all, and even eagerly wanted to take fragment samples for experiments. If Kelly wanted other things, Saul definitely wouldn't be stingy, but these bone fragments were too dangerous. One careless move could lead her down Firefly Lord Herbert's path, immediate irreversible mutation leading to death. Seeing Kelly's unwilling expression, Saul seriously refused again. "Even I have to handle that thing carefully. You just advanced to second rank and even your spiritual body isn't stable enough. How could you touch it? One careless contact means death." If it were anyone else seeing Saul's current expression, they definitely wouldn't dare say more. But Kelly was different. When it came to experimental research, her stubbornness was no less than Saul's. "I'm very careful. Look, I often use alpha and beta now and I've never had problems." Two highly radioactive alloy substances Kelly developed. Saul also understood Kelly's personality, usually carefree, but when it involved her research field, she became particularly stubborn. So Saul turned and walked away, not giving Kelly any chance to argue. Kelly was about to chase after him when she discovered her body couldn't move. How could she not know Saul was behind this? Saul casually opened the door sealed by magic. Halfway out he turned back. "Oh right, hurry up and advance to third rank. I'm still waiting for you to protect me." HMPH. Kelly bared her teeth at Saul like an annoyed teddy bear. After leaving the laboratory, Saul released his restraint on Kelly, but she didn't chase after him. She probably knew that chasing out would just get her restrained again. The consciousness entities in the dead wizard's diary watched the entire process. Bait first sighed. "Saul, you're really kind-hearted." Someone actively volunteered to test dangerous waters for him, yet he refused. Pear coldly snorted once, then bluntly complained. "Some people appear very kind on the surface, but once they do bad things, they have no limits." They're extreme north of Stat Continent, outside the Sighing Wall. The figure of Murphy, the strongest fourth-rank wizard here, flashed and appeared at a wizard tower built on the storm sea. The tower's outer walls were inscribed with offensive and defensive magical formations. But these couldn't stop a fourth-rank wizard. The reason Murphy didn't directly break in was because this wizard tower's current owner was Gorsa, a man who had just advanced to third rank a few years ago, but declared he would advance to fourth rank. And remarkably, no one questioned his words. Chapter 808, Afraid There's No Road at the End. As a fourth-rank wizard and creator of the Sighing Wall, white-haired Murphy stepped forward and knocked on the door of the wizard tower's top floor. Inside the wizard tower, Apprentice Haywood and his sister Heidi both looked up simultaneously. Strange, it's not time for touring wizards to visit. Why would someone come calling? If it were other wizard towers, there might be social visits, but Gorsa's wizard tower, under normal circumstances, truly no one came. I'll go see. Heidi, like a black shadow, was about to phase through the wall when she heard a low, slightly hoarse voice. You stay here. It was Gorsa's voice. Immediately, both Haywood and Heidi froze in place, responding quietly in acknowledgement. Gorsa slowly walked up the spiral staircase. He could clearly teleport directly outside the wizard tower, but he chose to walk over slowly. Even though the person waiting for him outside was the only fourth-rank wizard in the extreme north. Gorsa walked step by step to the top floor of the wizard tower and stood inside the door for a moment. The person outside already knew of his arrival but still made no sound, waiting quietly. As if at this moment, their positions and status had been reversed. Finally, Gorsa opened the door and faced the old man respected by many wizards outside, smiling slightly. Lord Murphy, what brings you here? Murphy didn't answer immediately but slowly scanned Gorsa's entire body from top to bottom, then bottom to top. This heir of the Glare family possessed the handsome appearance characteristic of their lineage. His unkempt long hair was messy yet graceful, and his skin was so white it seemed to glow. But when Murphy examined Gorsa, he completely ignored the other's appearance. Even when he met Gorsa's golden eyes again, he let out a sigh. It seems you're already prepared. Murphy's expression was complex, his face showing compassion. Have you thought about what will happen if you fail? Gorsa tilted his head, as if hearing a question so simple it made him laugh. Then I'll just die. Murphy shook his head, both admiring the young man's courage and regretting his recklessness. Death comes in many forms. Some deaths happen in an instant. You don't even feel pain, it's just that the world ends for you. But some deaths are very long. You might beg for it all to end in an endless black night, yet be powerless to do anything. Murphy's voice was full of lamentation, as if he were experiencing all this himself. Gorsa slowly shook his head. I'm not afraid of dying, nor am I afraid of living. Then what are you afraid of? Murphy didn't get angry at Gorsa's repeated contradictions. Instead, he was even in the mood to joke. Tell me, so I can use it to scare you. Gorsa's curved eyes blinked. I'm afraid there's no road at the end, afraid of losing the courage to move forward. Murphy's lips suddenly trembled and his smile became somewhat forced. You really blocked me off in both directions. He sighed deeply. You're braver than I am. Then I won't try to dissuade you, but how much longer do you need to take that final step? Gorsa raised his hand to tap his chin. I'm waiting for an opportunity. I think it should be soon. Murphy asked with a smile, can you still help during the next black tide outbreak? Gorsa only gave a vague estimate, probably. After their conversation, Murphy left alone. During the time they talked through the door, Murphy didn't ask to come in, and Gorsa didn't invite him in. They understood each other tacitly, as if they weren't people from the same world. After escaping from Kelly's laboratory, Saul saw Hope waiting for him in the corridor again. checking the time and seeing he still had enough. Saul, this incompetent tower master, finally had time to hear Hope's report on the situation at the Purity Wizard Tower in Rhine City. Although Hope's previous master Gorsa was also incompetent, at least he stayed in the Wizard Tower year-round, so Hope could find him for urgent matters. Saul, on the other hand, simply disappeared, only returning for a few days each time, as if the Purity Wizard Tower were just an inn where he stopped to rest. Hope saw that Saul was still eager to handle other matters, so he reported the situation in a quick but clear voice. The current Lord of Rhine City is Luke, who was once your patient. I observed for a while and found his loyalty to you very high and his mind flexible, so I had him temporarily manage Rhine City's affairs. If you have other candidates, you can replace him at any time. No need let it be him. We'll deal with problems if they arise. Saul waved his hand broadly, directly agreeing. Luke was extremely loyal to him. Even his fate lines had appeared around Saul. Hope nodded in acknowledgement and spoke about Wizard Tower matters. I've recruited some more wizards, mainly first-rank wizards, to coordinate with the various experimental projects currently at the Purity Wizard Tower. Now the Wizard Tower wasn't like when Gorsa was here, with a mentor teaching many apprentices. It was more like a combination of Sky City's Academy of Knowledge and Academy of Practice, organized around experimental research projects, with one or several true wizards leading senior apprentices in research. They weren't responsible for training new apprentices. Anyway, true wizards surviving in the borderland were no weaklings, and wizard apprentices were even more tenacious. Saul continued nodding. Just consult Byron and Kelly. Saul was now a third-rank wizard, and his method for advancing to fourth rank was unique. No one could participate in his experiments. After reporting everything, Hope bowed respectfully and immediately withdrew. Saul went down the stairs to the second basement level, where little Algie was sealed. Just as he opened the door to the second basement level, Saul saw a black shadow rushing toward his face. Saul's eyes were quick and his hands fast. He grabbed it in one motion. Woo-woo-woo-woo. Little Algie's shark-like mouth was skillfully held shut by Saul, gripping its upper and lower jaws. Not daring to struggle forcefully, it could only obediently play pitiful. Saul smiled with relief. Little Algie, you're awake. How do you feel? Is the Black Sea tree working well? After Saul released his grip, little Algie came forward again, wrapping around Saul's shoulders twice like a scarf. Tilda. Why do you look a bit aggrieved? Saul thought to himself as he continued walking down. Then he saw the body connected behind little Algie's tentacle. Little Algie's originally thick main trunk was gone, replaced by dense, slender, curved branches tangled together indistinguishably. It looked even more like a ball of seaweed than its original form. Moreover, its size wasn't large. Saul could lift it with both hands. It even trembled slightly when moved. Saul poked it with his finger, and the tangled ball of seaweed moved twice, then shrank even smaller. After carefully observing for a while, Saul frowned and looked up at the only tentacle tip still extending outside. Little Algie, tell the truth, did you tangle yourself into a knot you can't untie? Ying yang yang yang. Chapter 809, Creating a Fake Strom Eye. Yes, after awakening from its slumber, little Algie discovered its body had shrunk. Its tentacles, which had originally been as thick as a thigh, were now only as thin as a baby's arm and continuing to shrink. Before Saul arrived, they had already shrunk to the size of ordinary human fingers. Also, perhaps it had developed a sleepwalking habit while asleep. Either way, when it woke up, it was already tangled into a ball, the kind that couldn't be straightened out no matter what. Little Algie had tried very hard to untangle itself, but after wriggling around, it only became more tightly wound. Its entire body, except for the bit exposed outside, had all been tangled into a ball. Saul poked at little Algy's ball, then finally shook his head. Forget it, just stay like this for now. Once your body completely stabilizes, you should be able to untangle yourself. If it still didn't work in the end, worst case Saul could just cut little Algy apart. Sometimes you have to break something to rebuild it. Once everything was cut open, he could connect it back together. Thinking this jokingly, Saul patted little Algy's head. I came to check on you. You're recovering well. Just rest well for the next while. Probably in a year or two you'll be able to continue. Saul didn't finish because little Algy, along with its ball behind it, had already performed a carp jump and leaped onto Saul's face, directly covering it. Saul pulled little Algy off his face. Its new body was quite sticky, making a ripping sound as he peeled it away. Looking more carefully, that wasn't stickiness. Little Algy's entire body was covered with densely packed hooks. Saul quickly felt his face, fortunately not tearing off a layer of skin. Little Algy, pulled off by Saul, wrapped around his neck again and climbed toward his head. Seeing little Algy so persistently climbing on him, Saul understood its intention. You want to come with me? Whining. Little Algy nodded happily. Indeed, since first meeting little Algy, the two had almost never been separated. Even in the Chaos Realm, little Algy was the first to accompany Saul there. Saul once again stroked little Algy's ball. This time little Algy retracted all its barbs, feeling quite smooth to the touch. While Saul petted little Algy and considered whether to bring it along, little Algy quietly wrapped around him without acting spoiled. If Saul ultimately decided not to take little Algy, it would probably still obediently listen. Seeing such a well-behaved little Algy, Saul couldn't bring himself to refuse. Fine, then come with me. Sleep is sleep wherever you do it. Hearing Saul agree, little Algy immediately rubbed Saul's neck continuously with its tentacle tip, looking very happy. After rubbing for a moment, it dove headfirst into Saul's nape, and the ball behind it also disappeared beneath Saul's skin. Saul raised his hand to feel his nape. There was a small bump there. That had never been there before. Looks like it really is a dead knot. Little Algy seemed to have completely fused with the Black Sea tree and inverted tree seeds, no longer the same type of demonic creature as the original soul-devouring mire. As for what it was now, Saul didn't know. It was probably a new species. None before, and there probably wouldn't be any again in the future. Saul smiled and looked around the second basement level. Only one not yet fully developed Black Sea tree remained here. With little Algy leaving, with no one competing for nutrients, it might grow faster. Taking little Algy away from the second basement level and resealing the door, Saul returned to Byron's side. Byron had already begun new studies. Although water god Floco had only taught him for half a day, it had brought him considerable impact, and he was now busy consolidating his knowledge. Kate floated in the water tank like a corpse, only climbing out when he saw Saul enter. Saul, do I have to stay in this body for a long time? Kate was somewhat aggrieved. Seeing Kate make an aggrieved expression with the mermaid's face made Saul feel it was rather unsightly. I'll have to trouble you for a while longer. Having the water god's help will make the upcoming journey much easier. The upcoming journey? You're taking me to Nefret too? Kate's eyes widened. I already said I'd return this smuggled mermaid. Besides, I'm curious what the mermaids there are like. Oh, when the water god possesses your body, are you conscious? Kate recalled his previous feelings. I'm conscious but not very clearly, hazy like dreaming. When Floco's consciousness descended into the mermaid body, his fifth-rank energy would inevitably suppress Kate, a second rank. The reason Kate wasn't injured was probably because Floco had been careful to protect his consciousness. Just then the door opened and Kelly rushed in. She didn't continue asking for bone fragments, because Saul's behavior just now clearly showed he wouldn't agree to let her experiment with bone fragments. Perhaps only when her strength improved further might she be able to access bone fragments. Seeing Kelly arrive, Saul didn't continue fleeing but said very seriously to both of them, "Kelly, Sr." Kelly approached, looking at Saul quietly like a lady. Byron also looked up at him. "Next I'll make a trip to Nefret. This time will probably also take about half a year. During this period, I'll still need to trouble you both with the Wizard Tower." Byron asked with some concern, "When you go there, will you be targeted? Will they refuse to let you return?" Saul smiled and said, "I'm not afraid of being targeted. Besides, they can't keep me trapped forever, not letting me return. I'm currently the only third-rank wizard in the borderland. If another Strom Eye is discovered, they'll still need me to return and resolve the Black Tide threat. Even if they wanted to trap me, they'd only dare do so for about half a year. Any longer and neither the Stargate Council nor Sky City would agree." This was Saul's current special status, with 3 fourth-rank wizards representing different factions in mutual check and balance, keeping Saul in a relatively safe position. While the Tribunal's invitation to Saul appeared to be asking for help solving certain mermaid problems, essentially, they probably still wanted to probe Saul's abilities and background. After all, Saul and Gorsa were now in the same camp, while other factions knew too little about Saul. Seeing Kelly and Byron finally looking relieved, Saul changed the subject. "Of course, I also need to guard against them wanting to tie down my steps for other purposes, so there's something I need to ask of you both." Kelly placed one hand on Saul's shoulder. "Speak." Her ladylike demeanor instantly crumbled. "If something happens that you think requires my immediate return, or if the Tribunal has some conspiracy, you need to find a way to create an opportunity that forces me to return. Create a fake Strom Eye." Byron pressed his lips together. Kelly's eyes widened. Strom Eyes were harbingers of Black Tide eruptions. How could Kelly, who was second rank, and Byron, who was nearly second rank, create such a terrifying thing? After thinking for a moment, Byron was first to react. "You want to use the reverse inertization formula?" Saul nodded with a smile. The reverse inertization formula, as the name suggested, was the reverse reaction formula of the inertization formula. That is, turning completely inertized black powder back into black tide with powerful polluting force. Although the reverse inertization formula couldn't work on a large scale, faking a Storm Eye about to be born was still possible. Chapter 810, Arrival at Evernight. Kelly raised a question, but the birth of Storm Eye involves not just pollution, but also crucial spatial reactions. Before Saul could answer her doubt, Kelly suddenly realized it herself. "Otilda the Chaos Realm Compass." Saul nodded with satisfaction. Both could understand his intentions well. Their tacit understanding was quite high. "When the time comes, Senior Byron will be responsible for performing the reverse inertization formula, while Kelly, you'll activate the Chaos Realm Compass. But be careful not to go through completely. Open it and close it quickly, so people can't find the Storm Eye's exact location. That would be more realistic." When Storm Eyes appeared in the Borderland 2 years ago, the Tribunal, Stargate Council, and Sky City all received advance notice. They must have discovered some clues. After Saul personally sealed a Storm Eye, he also knew which precursors and signs indicated a Storm Eye had appeared. Naturally, he was confident in creating a fake Storm Eye. Once a Storm Eye appeared, he would have to immediately return to the Borderland. Even if the Tribunal wasn't ready to let him return, people from the Stargate Council would personally come to retrieve him. The Tribunal's carriage needed 3 days to cross Dwarf Valley, so these 3 days were equivalent to Saul returning to the Wizard Tower for a vacation. Of course, he wasn't really relaxing on vacation, but continued discussing with Kelly and Byron how to make the fake storm eye more realistic, and how to let people from the Stargate Council and Tribunal discover the fake storm eye's existence in time. The 3 days passed in a flash. Before noon on the third day, Saul's figure flashed and he returned to the Tribunal's flying horse carriage. Still the same dark, crude little carriage. "Master," Herman asked tentatively. "Snap." Saul snapped his fingers, illuminating the entire carriage. "Experiment successful. The temporary coordinate is usable." He was very satisfied. This time returning, he hadn't used Herman's fate line to locate his teleportation, but rather used the temporary coordinate he had created. The temporary coordinate wasn't a fate line, but rather a relatively large point. When Saul touched this point, he could also complete teleportation. However, this temporary coordinate couldn't be maintained for very long. Saul's first-made temporary coordinate could last at most 10 days. It could only be used for emergencies, not for long-term positioning. But after more research, he might be able to extend the temporary coordinate's maintenance period to several months. Then it could be used in many more scenarios. The Tribunal's carriage was still traveling steadily on the ground. Saul satisfactorily retrieved his soul fragment, then pushed the carriage door open a crack to signal to the coachman that he had returned. Outside the carriage, the coachman's back, entirely covered in a cloak, suddenly stiffened, then slowly relaxed. "Lord Saul, welcome back." The coachman's voice was always low and hoarse, but today it was particularly exhausted, as if all his strength had been drained. Saul now knew that others couldn't teleport within Dwarf Valley, but he couldn't very well discuss this with the coachman. So he continued pretending not to know, notified the coachman of his return, then closed the carriage door again and sat inside meditating, recovering his spiritual body that had fluctuated slightly due to teleportation. He didn't know that the Tribunal's coachman had truly been nervous for 3 days. Because his body had been too tense, when Saul returned and he relaxed for an instant, he nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Saul didn't know that this crude carriage he was in actually had hidden depths. Even after Frim's consciousness left the lantern, he couldn't escape the carriage. In fact, once Saul tried to escape the carriage or prepared to violently destroy it, the carriage would immediately activate defensive functions, mentally depriving Saul of his ability to act. Simply put, it would make him dizzy or fall asleep. Even if Saul wouldn't truly pass out due to his abnormal mental strength, he would still be unable to continue escaping due to severe oscillations of his spiritual body. Because the entire carriage was personally made by Frim for escorting disobedient high-rank wizards. Also because this carriage only transported powerful wizards, outsiders thought this was the Tribunal's highest standard for receiving guests. Who could imagine it was actually a cage? Those wizards who tried to escape, but failed, could vaguely guess this carriage's true purpose. But for the sake of face and dignity, they wouldn't reveal this matter. However, Frim, who created the carriage, probably never imagined that Saul didn't need to leave the carriage or violently destroy it. With just one teleportation, he could leave this hidden prison. Therefore, after Saul left, although the coachman still drove toward the teleportation array leading to Nefrit Continent according to the original plan, he was actually anxious inside, afraid Saul wouldn't return and he would fail to complete the chief's assigned task and face his wrath. Fortunately, Saul returned, and his mission could be completed on time. Saul's timing was very precise. 1 hour after his return, the carriage slowly stopped. Saul opened the door again and found they had arrived at another new magical formation. Last time, when landing on Escaper Continent's teleportation array, Saul hadn't had time to observe carefully. This time, looking out through the carriage door, he discovered this formation was surrounded by a wall that firmly enclosed the massive array. Every 10+ meters along the wall stood a pillar with a flame hovering 1 meter above each pillar. The wall was also inscribed with dense magical formations. Saul casually scanned several and discovered isolation arrays, protection arrays, attack arrays, and others. It seemed the tribunal had put considerable effort into protecting this ultra-long-distance teleportation array. Saul believed that once someone tried to destroy the formation or trespass without permission, those flames hovering above the pillars would teach them to be reborn as better people in their next life. Perhaps because the coachman was eager to hand Saul over, before Saul could observe more, he heard the coachman remind him, "It's about to begin. Please close the carriage door." Having somewhat guessed the reason for the coachman's nervousness, Saul didn't cause trouble and very cooperatively closed the door, actively stopping all magical power and mental energy fluctuations. The next second, spatial disorientation came again. This time the chaotic sensation was even stronger than before. Last time there should have been Frim's consciousness nearby, so the carriage's internal space was more stable than now. Despite the uncomfortable feeling from ultra-long-distance teleportation, Saul still had the mood to think. Due to rapid spatial changes, Saul's perception of time also became confused. Several times he even suspected time had been frozen, but the next instant everything returned to normal. After an unknown length of time, Saul finally heard the coachman outside say in his hoarse voice, "Lord Saul, we've arrived. You may come out." Saul closed his eyes and recovered for a few seconds. When he felt he had stabilized again, only then did he push open the door and step out. The scene outside the carriage somewhat surprised him. The flying horse carriage had stopped in the center of the formation, but around the formation's perimeter, a circle of people had actually gathered. In the direction Saul was facing, a golden carpet had even been laid out, just like a red carpet for welcoming guests. The coachman got down from the carriage and cleared the space. "Lord Saul, these people are important ministers and noble members of the Evernite Empire who have come to welcome you." After a pause, he added, "The Emperor of Evernite is waiting for your arrival in the royal palace." Chapter 811, Old Acquaintance. Actually, with Saul's status as a third-rank wizard, even the Emperor of the Evernite Empire should personally welcome him. But Saul wouldn't fuss over such things. After all, he might not necessarily respect the other party either. Several ministers and nobles from Evernite stood respectfully around the perimeter, but without Saul's signal, they didn't dare approach. Among the group were also several carefully selected beautiful women of various ages. While most wizards didn't care about appearance, there were still a few who indulged in beauty. If they could catch someone's eye, that would mean gaining a powerful backer. Unfortunately, this time Saul didn't even glance at them, directly stepping on the golden carpet and boarding the carriage heading to the Evernite royal palace. Saul thought he would take a carriage to meet whatever emperor of Evernite. However, after the carriage brought him to the Evernite royal palace, he was directly arranged to stay in a magnificent, spacious palace. All living necessities were provided, exquisite and expensive, as if Evernite's finest items had all been brought for Saul's use. But unlike the generous material treatment, after Saul entered this royal palace, no one paid attention to him. It wasn't that no one paid attention. Countless guards and maids stood outside his door, and with just one command from Saul, hundreds would serve him. But the people who should have come to see Saul never appeared. Like the Emperor of Evernite, or people from the tribunal. However, Saul wasn't anxious either. After all, they had invited him to solve the problem of mermaids being polluted by the black tide, and he had prepared to stay on Nefrit continent for half a year. Worst case, he could develop this palace into a second laboratory. Anyway, Saul's storage device carried large quantities of magical materials and experimental equipment. And if any emergency required his return, he trusted Byron and Kelly could make the decision to create a fake storm eye. With these preparations, Saul settled peacefully into this magnificent yet empty palace. It wasn't until the evening of the third day that someone finally knocked on the palace door. Saul didn't immediately get up. He was contemplating who he could choose from Evernight as the third target for his symphony of fate. Therefore, when the knocking sounded, Saul didn't respond immediately. The person outside was also very patient, waiting another 5 minutes before knocking a second time. "Please come in." Saul put down his pen and paper. He hadn't yet determined his target. He knew too little about Nefret. Aside from Tribunal Chief Frym, he had barely interacted with anyone else. Through contact with the line-like beings calling themselves death demons in the prismatic world, he knew his chosen targets should be brave souls who could face constantly fluctuating destinies, not strong individuals already standing at the world's peak. So Frym wasn't a good choice. "No rush, I still have plenty of time to observe." Saul looked up just as someone pushed open the palace door from outside. Standing outside was a third-rank wizard. This third-rank wizard had inverted triangular eyes and slightly downturned mouth corners, looking like he had a very bad temper. But when facing Saul, he still tried to show a polite smile, though this smile only pulled his downturned mouth corners to straight. "Hello, Lord Saul." Seeing a wizard of the same rank, Saul didn't put on airs and stood up directly. "Hello, and you are?" The wizard with inverted triangular eyes then entered. "I am a court wizard of Evernight, Alfonso. I major in dark attribute elements." "What a coincidence, so do I," Saul joked. But the serious Alfonso clearly didn't think this was a joke. "It's not a coincidence. We both major in dark attribute elements, which is why we're together today to research methods for solving black tide pollution." Seeing the other's personality was as serious as his appearance, Saul shrugged indifferently. "Fine, then can we start on business now? After being here several days, I was starting to think you invited me here to keep me under house arrest." "The chief did say not to let you wander around." Alfonso actually directly revealed his superior's true intentions. After hearing this, Saul threw his feather pen onto the table. "What, afraid I'll explore the tribunal's secrets?" This time Alfonso didn't speak, clearly defaulting to agreement. Since the other was so direct, Saul was too lazy for small talk. "Did you come today because we can start researching mermaids? I brought a mermaid here. Wonder how it differs from your local ones." Alfonso quietly waited for Saul to finish before nodding. "You're having a mermaid shows you have some understanding of this race. That's good." Then he added, "But today we're not going to the mermaids first. We're going to see the Emperor of Evernight." Saul was stunned. During his days here, he hadn't seen the Emperor of the Evernight Empire, and had thought the other party simply didn't plan to show up. Although it didn't match the grand welcoming ceremony from the nobles, Saul originally had no interest in meeting emperors anyway. Unexpectedly, after waiting several days, he was going to meet him after all. Could this emperor's identity be complicated? Is he a wizard like Senior Morden? "Please don't resist, I'll take you there directly." Alfonso extended his left hand towards Saul, powerful magical energy surging in his palm. Saul squinted. He actually felt spatial oscillations. Whoosh! Alfonso's left hand suddenly burst into black flames, which then exploded. In that instant, Saul's vision blurred, and he found the room before him had changed to another. This room was equally exquisite and magnificent. The wallpaper patterns on the walls were woven from rare plant-based magical materials. The floor tiles beneath his feet had dense patterns hiding magical formations of unknown purpose. Not to mention other decorations. Everything seemed to have deliberate wizard design touches. Saul scanned the arrangements before him, thinking, this emperor is either a high-rank wizard or has some special identity. But compared to this emperor's identity, Saul was now more interested in Wizard Alfonso. After all, the other party had just demonstrated teleportation magic. Any wizard who could master teleportation before 4th rank, even incomplete teleportation, would have considerable development prospects. Saul was moved. Would this Alfonso be suitable as my third target? Seeing Saul lost in thought, Alfonso waited a moment before saying, Lord Saul, the Emperor of Evernight is behind you. Saul came back to his senses and nodded to Alfonso. Though he had just arrived, he had already noticed someone behind him. But since the other party had no magical fluctuations, he had assumed it was a guard or similar role. It seemed this emperor wasn't a wizard and didn't even have magical tools. Completely incompatible with the room they were in. Saul, with his slightly piqued curiosity, turned around and was momentarily stunned. Upon seeing Saul's face, the Emperor of Evernight opened his mouth in surprise. Lord Saul. Sander, how are you here? Sander appeared in the Blue Water Bay Soul Tide storyline and was taken away by tribunal people after the protagonist left. Chapter 812, Quite Miserable. The last time Saul saw Sander was when he rescued his sister Mido's soul from the Soul Tide at Blue Water Bay. After that, to thank Saul, the other party had given him the ancestral Chaos Realm Compass. Of course, at that time Sander only knew the Chaos Realm Compass might be a magical tool, unaware of just how rare a magical artifact it truly was. Naturally, as an ordinary person, even if he had known, he couldn't have activated it. Moreover, activating the Chaos Realm Compass also required the ancient magical coins in Saul's possession. These were items passed down from before the Crescent Calendar. At the time, Saul had wondered whether Sander, who lived so poorly yet had an innate pride, and possessed such ancient and powerful magical tools, might have some background. But he never imagined that, after a few years, the other party would transform from a down-and-out street merchant into the emperor of the strongest empire on Nefrit continent. Alfonso also hadn't expected Saul and the emperor to know each other. He looked left and right, but still didn't ask about their relationship. As a court wizard, he naturally knew the current emperor had recently been brought back from Stat Continent, royal bloodline that had been living in exile. Since the other party had been on the same continent as Saul before, they should have met then. Since you two know each other, that makes things easier. Your Majesty, Lord Saul, let's sit over there and talk. Alfonso raised his hand, inviting the two to sit on the sofa at the far end of the room. Saul watched Sander slowly walk over. From his complexion and gait, his body seemed extremely weak. Sander's skin was not only much paler than their last meeting, but had a bloodless pallor. Looks like Sander's life as emperor isn't great either. He remembered that Sander wasn't among those who came to welcome him, probably because his physical condition didn't allow it. The last time I saw him, his physical and mental state were quite good. After Sander sat down, Saul directly placed his hand on the back of the other's neck. Sander's body stiffened, but he didn't dodge. Alfonso sat leisurely in place, also showing no wariness. No problems with the soul body. The body has been modified, constitution strengthened. Have you been rather unrestrained since becoming emperor? Faced with such a direct question from Saul, Sander smiled bitterly. Lord Saul, I have no say in this matter. Saul looked at Alfonso with a strange expression. Unlike court wizards of the Kema Empire, Alfonso clearly wasn't as respectful toward Sander. There was even a sense of managing him. Seeing Saul look over, Alfonso nodded. His Majesty Alexandra is Evernight's only remaining royal bloodline and must leave behind more heirs as soon as possible. Saul's mouth twitched. Looking at it this way, it really wasn't Sandor becoming indulgent due to his sudden change in status. "How many children do you have now?" he asked the somewhat embarrassed Sandor. Sandor pressed his lips together, his complexion becoming even worse. None at all." His voice was as thin as a mosquito's. Saul was silent for a moment, then placed his palm on Sandor's nape again. Sandor lowered his head, knowing Saul was going to help examine his body. Unlike last time, this time he felt something sharp pierce directly into his nape. Intense pain immediately traveled along his spine to his brain, but just as he was about to reflexively dodge, he discovered his body had become as cold and frozen as ice, unable even to lift his head. Large beads of sweat immediately emerged from his forehead and nose, gathering together before dripping down his cheeks onto his chest. Alfonso watched from the side, becoming somewhat curious about Saul and Sandor's relationship. Saul was causing Alexandra such pain, yet the latter didn't even cast a pleading glance his way. This showed complete trust in Saul. Ordinary friendship wouldn't produce such behavior. However, Alfonso was merely curious. He didn't truly care about the Evernight Emperor's emotions or social connections. After all, this emperor was only a figurehead who couldn't even access Evernight's government affairs, merely existing to continue the bloodline and. While Alfonso was thinking, Saul finally lifted his hand. Sandor, who had been tormented considerably, immediately slumped forward in the next second, fainting. Saul raised his hand to let Sandor lean back against the sofa, while casting a spell to heal the trauma caused by his examination. At the same time, since Sandor had fainted, Saul could communicate with Alfonso without considering Sandor's feelings. "Lord Frym invited me here to treat black tide pollution in mermaids, but you brought me to see Sandor first. Could it be that mermaids are just a cover, and the real purpose is to have me treat His Majesty the Emperor?" Alfonso maintained his serious expression. It would be more accurate to say that treating the Evernight Emperor is part of treating mermaid pollution. Saul cupped his chin, speculating. Could it be that forcing Sandor to quickly produce heirs is also related to mermaids? Alfonso nodded. "Evernight's royal family doesn't have mermaid bloodline, does it?" "More or less." Saul extended his hand directly toward Alfonso. "Please explain." Alfonso had brought Saul to see the Evernight Emperor this time to clarify matters. He paused for a moment to organize his thoughts before beginning to explain the relationship between Evernight's royal family and the mermaid race. "You know that the southeastern coastline of Nefrit continent is covered with Red Sea trees, right?" Saul was quite knowledgeable about things related to black tide pollution. "Yes, used to absorb the black tide surging from the abyssal eye. Red Sea trees can absorb black tide pollution but cannot eliminate it. When absorbed pollution reaches a certain level, the Red Sea trees will have their accumulated pollution backfire. Even if methods are found to collect and isolate the pollution, it causes great harm. To solve the Red Sea trees' pollution backfire, the tribunal spent 10 years separating mermaid bloodlines from ancient bloodlines and created large numbers of mermaids. Through modification, they weakened the mermaid race's spiritual bodies while purely enhancing physical tolerance, making them more suited to black tide pollution than other races. They can even survive in it for periods of time. The modified mermaids feed on the root plants that grow from Red Sea tree bases. These root plants are where Red Sea trees store black tide pollution. Saul's eye twitched slightly, suddenly thinking of the mermaid left in his palace. He had noticed then that the mermaid had very low intelligence, seemingly possessing only basic survival instincts, yet could survive with large amounts of pollution in its body. But even if they could adapt to pollution, there was still a limit. Red Sea trees would backfire pollution they couldn't store. What about mermaids? When they ate the polluted roots produced by Red Sea trees and the pollution in their bodies reached the limit, the only outcome would be destruction, right? When water god Floco was at a critical moment of recovering his strength, he still split his consciousness to inhabit the mermaid Saul carried. Was this to see what living conditions his descendant mermaid race currently faced? Looking at it now, it was truly quite miserable. Chapter 813, The Pitiful Emperor. The mermaid race's situation was miserable, and Sander before him also seemed to have troubles he couldn't voice. Alfonso informed Saul of the Evernight Emperor's existential value. After extracting the mermaid bloodline back then, to better control the mermaids, the tribunal's predecessors also extracted the royal bloodline from among the mermaids and fused it into Evernight's royal descendants. Alfonso looked at Sander, who was sleeping peacefully. Control the mermaids by controlling the royal family. Of course, as compensation, the tribunal would also guarantee that the Evernight royal family's status remained unchanged. But didn't you say that now only Sander remains of the royal bloodline? Saul found it amusing. The Evernight royal family's status hadn't changed, but there were barely any people left. Yes, Alfonso frowned, clearly also troubled by this matter. Perhaps it's a curse, perhaps fate's design. The originally prosperous Evernight royal family with many relatives began declining in numbers after accepting the mermaid bloodline. Even with the chief personally intervening, the trend of decreasing royal personnel couldn't be stopped. Now, aside from Alexandra, no one else in the entire royal family possesses mermaid royal bloodline. So you're looking for me mainly to, Saul paused, feeling something was odd, make Sander have children. Alphonse actually nodded. That explanation works too. The upcoming experiments will mainly be handled by the two of us. We initially believe that Alexandra has never had children born because the mermaid royal bloodline in his body is too thin. Although he can still currently calm mermaids, he cannot pass the bloodline to his descendants. So we plan to take out the remaining mermaid royal bloodline and fuse it into another person to see if we can create a new royal family. Noticing the change in pronouns in Alfonso's words, fusing into another person, you're planning to abandon Sander. Yes, the current Evernight royal house cannot undergo a second bloodline fusion. Of course, if Sander can have descendants with sufficient bloodline concentration before the new royal house is born, then we'll let him continue as emperor. Oh, poor Sander. Brought back by Evernight only to be treated as a breeding tool. Not only that, but a backup breeding tool. You just mentioned that the Evernight royal family is still needed to pacify the mermaid race. How exactly does this pacification work? Saul asked. This time Alfonso was silent for a moment. His blood can calm mermaids. Saul couldn't help but look at the still sleeping Sander. With his pale, weak appearance, he certainly couldn't participate in government. And to better continue the bloodline, overly luxurious enjoyment was definitely out of the question. Truly a pitiful emperor. Regardless, Saul had a good impression of Sander. He stood up and asked, if the tribunal creates a new royal family, what will happen to Sander? Alfonso pursed his lips. Since Alexandra knows you, giving him a noble identity and letting him live in seclusion in the countryside would be acceptable. This meant that if Saul didn't intend to preserve Sander's life, the tribunal probably wouldn't leave him alive. They likely didn't want two royal families existing simultaneously in the world, affecting the tribunal's control over the mermaid race. Even if they agreed to let Sander retire to the countryside, they would definitely assign people to watch him, forcing him to spend the rest of his life in the same place. Knowing Saul understood his meaning, Alfonso stood up from the sofa. The situation here has been explained thoroughly. I'll take you to see the Bloodline Research Laboratory. The mermaid race is by the coast. We need to take a teleportation array, so we'll go tomorrow." Saul nodded readily, but before leaving, he still walked to the sleeping Sander. "You don't mind if I take some of his blood to research, do you?" "Of course, you can start experimenting now." Alfonso raised his hand, indicating Saul could proceed freely. Saul took small amounts of blood and tissue from both veins and arteries, then followed Alfonso out of the Evernight Emperor's palace. Long after the two left, Sander slowly opened his eyes. His expression was clear, completely unlike someone who had just awakened. Suddenly, a blue butterfly appeared in his right eye's pupil, dancing gracefully within the eyeball. "Mido," Sander said quietly, "do you think we can still ask him for help?" The blue butterfly flew to the edge of the right eye and disappeared, quickly reappearing in the left eyeball. "I understand." In silence, the two completed their communication. Sander closed his eyes again, not even changing his position. He knew that at the appointed time, someone would wake him to rest in his chambers. After all, the servants here were extremely concerned about his physical condition. At this time, Saul, who had left the royal palace, followed Alfonso in teleportation to another location. This place was completely different in style from the cold, quiet royal palace. Busy tribunal wizards could be seen everywhere, some conducting experiments with various instruments, others observing while taking notes, and still others bent over inscribing different micro-magical formations. After Saul entered with Alfonso, not one person actively greeted them, as if everyone was too busy to spare attention. Alfonso also had no intention of introducing Saul, leading him straight toward the innermost area. As Saul walked and observed, with his current knowledge base, he could easily discern what experiments these wizards were conducting. In his view, the experiment to fuse mermaid bloodlines was probably still in its initial stages. They hadn't yet integrated a comprehensive design approach. However, without understanding the complete picture, Saul wouldn't casually offer suggestions. The two entered a separate laboratory. This place had dedicated wizard guards, but no one conducting research experiments, clearly Alfonso's exclusive laboratory. "Sit first," Alfonso pointed casually, then walked to the wall at the far end of the room. The wall was inscribed with an unusual magical formation that looked like a combination of a parallelogram and moon shape. This was Saul's first time seeing this type of combined magical formation, so he observed it with great interest. Sensing Saul's gaze, Alfonso didn't avoid him and extended his hand to draw two compound runes on the formation. After completing the symbols, the entire magical formation glowed. Alfonso inserted his arm directly into the wall's interior. When he withdrew it, his palm held two test tubes. One test tube was filled with clear, transparent liquid, with a deep blue small sphere suspended in the center. The other test tube contained a small amount of dark red liquid, only covering the tube's bottom. Alfonso pointed to the tube with the blue sphere. "This is bloodline fusion liquid. This amount can probably be used 3 times. The other contains mermaid royal bloodline that the chief gave me, also only usable 3 times. So before we officially begin experimenting, we must prepare all preliminary work thoroughly to avoid waste as much as possible." Looking at the dark red liquid, Saul's heart stirred and he blurted out, "Could I have a sample of the mermaid royal bloodline to take back for research?" Chapter 814, Roy. "Not for now," Alfonso said with a straight face. "I'll give you the relevant research materials. Once you're familiar with the knowledge, I'll apply to the chief." Saul sighed in disappointment. "If you won't give it to me, why take it out to make me envious?" Alfonso remained expressionless, his mouth corners slightly downturned. Using actual objects to explain knowledge is more concrete. After saying this, he walked to the experimental table and casually placed the two precious test tubes on a rack. The mermaid race's bloodline is inherited from the ancient Azure Scale clan. However, before the Abyssal Eye appeared, most of the Azure Scale clan had already left this world. Those who remained were mostly lower-tier Azure Scale clan members, also called the mermaid race. Here are the relevant reference books. You can take them back to read today. Alfonso waved his hand, and 3 stacks of books a meter high appeared on the ground. Each book's pages looked quite old with uneven edges, as if they were frequently consulted. Alfonso explained, "When researching, I'm accustomed to recording my knowledge on paper rather than in magical tools." Many high-rank wizards now preferred recording knowledge in knowledge array discs that could be read directly with mental power. They were convenient to carry and allowed fast knowledge retrieval. But Alfonso still preferred using books for recording and reading, like lower-rank wizards. Saul had no objections. "I also just advanced to 3rd rank recently. Well, actually, I just advanced to 1st and 2nd rank recently too, so I really enjoy reading books." Saul placed his hand on the topmost book. With a thought, all the books were collected into the spatial storage device on his wrist. Then he looked up at Alfonso, whose brow was deeply furrowed. "Please rest assured, I'll treat your knowledge well." Alfonso's furrowed brow relaxed slightly. "That's good then." After handing over the research books to Saul, he began explaining the characteristics of mermaid royal bloodline and the fusion agent. This fusion liquid was personally researched and created by the chief. It's extremely rare and very unstable. When using it, only glass tweezers can be used for extraction. When exposed to air, it will spontaneously combust within 3 seconds, so after taking out the fusion liquid, it must be added to the bloodline within 3 seconds, preferably within 1 second. Alfonso spoke earnestly. Saul listened attentively, and the 2 guard wizards in the room stood nearby, seemingly completely unconcerned with their conversation. Time passed bit by bit during their discussion. In Saul's perception, the sun should be setting soon. Alfonso and Saul's first academic discussion was also coming to an end. Now the mermaid royal bloodline's activity is not what it once was. If we're to create a new Evernight royal family this time, the chief might consume most of the remaining bloodline. After all, this bloodline might not last until the next royal lineage depletion. Alfonso closed his book and stood to return the 2 test tubes to the magical formation in the wall. Just then, someone suddenly knocked urgently on the door of this independent laboratory. Knock, 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 knock. Very rapid knocking. Saul noticed Alfonso's expression hadn't changed, and he didn't even seem to intend to open the door. He turned to look, and just as he turned around, the door was suddenly pushed open directly. As if the previous urgent knocking was just an announcement declaring, "I'm coming in," rather than "Please open the door for me." The door was forcefully pushed open, hitting the wall before bouncing back into the intruder's hands. Someone who doesn't get along with Alfonso. Saul had just thought this when he overthrew his own assumption. Because the person who had just entered wore a brilliant smile, not domineering or sarcastic, just a genuinely happy smile. "Alfonso, I'm back. Did you miss me?" The intruder had flaming red hair, probably as red as the sunset outside. His hair wasn't long but very thick, bouncing rhythmically as he walked. After entering, he forcefully pulled the door behind him. The door slammed shut with a bang, and the walls seemed to tremble slightly. "Oh, there's a guest." Redhair looked at Saul. "Ah, I know, this is the guest the chief invited back. You're Wizard Saul, right? Hello, I'm called Royer, Alfonso's friend, his best friend." Royer was very enthusiastic upon seeing Saul, like a living flame, completely incompatible with the other wizards in this laboratory. Saul's first reaction wasn't to greet Royer, but to turn back and look at Alfonso's expression. The other's eyes were downcast, but his downturned mouth corners had straightened slightly. They should indeed be real friends. Saul turned back again, looking at the enthusiastic Royer, and stood up to say friendly, "Hello, Wizard Royer." Royer made no effort to conceal his magical fluctuations. Fire attribute elemental particles, as active as his personality, were most concentrated, their strong amplitude indicating his powerful third-rank wizard strength. Royer walked to the experimental table. "What are you doing?" "Oh, mermaid royal bloodline. If you ask me, forget about what royal family or not, just fuse the bloodline in first. Whoever survives becomes emperor, and the dead ones can just be fed to fish." Alfonso waved his hand. "This isn't your experimental project. Your opinion isn't needed." This was said rather impolitely, but Royer didn't care at all, still wearing his smile. "I'm just worried about you wasting energy. A genius dark attribute wizard like Wizard Saul should directly research Red Sea trees. If we could improve the Red Sea trees' pollution absorption ability, or improve our pollution processing methods, wouldn't that be much more useful than researching mermaids?" "The project Wizard Royer researches is Red Sea tree?" Saul asked. Royer nodded vigorously, not at all like a third-rank wizard. "That's right. Do you think it's easy for me? I major in fire elements, but now I have to research how to plant trees in the sea. Life is truly unpredictable." As he spoke, Royer even wanted to grab Saul's arm. "You should be done talking too. Let me take you to see the seaside Red Sea trees. Red Sea trees at dusk are the most beautiful. If you like, I can also bring along 2 pretty female wizards. Do you have any special preferences? Do you like ones that look like humans, or ones that don't really look like humans?" Alfonso's previously straightened mouth corners turned downward again. Saul stroked his chin, cooperatively and tentatively asking, "Are there mermaids that fit human aesthetic standards?" Nefrit continent had large numbers of mermaids, and mermaids used as janitors and vacuum cleaners obviously wouldn't have high social status, being even lower than dust before wizards. Saul thought that by saying this, he might be able to get a mermaid from Royer or Alfonso to take back and compare with Kate. However, unexpectedly, Royer suddenly stopped smiling and could even be said to look disgusted to the point of nausea. "No, no, no. Saul, my friend, you wouldn't like mermaids. They're the most lowly species. What you're saying sounds to me like wanting to sleep with rats from cracks in the ground. It makes me sick." Royer quickly smiled again, shrugging. "But I won't blame you. After all, you're not from Nefrit and it's normal not to understand mermaids. I'll pick a pretty girl for you. You can tear off her wings. Very exciting." Saul interlaced his fingers, placed them on the table, and smiled. "I'll pass on that. I just received dozens of magical research notes from Wizard Alfonso, so I won't have time to tear off anyone's wings in the short term." Chapter 815, Coral. Royer clearly wanted to continue persuading, but Alfonso on the side couldn't listen anymore. He suddenly stood up and raised his voice. "Royer." Royer still wore his smile as he looked at his friend. Snap. Alfonso suddenly snapped his fingers, and Royer completely disappeared. Then he said to Saul, "I moved Royer outside the laboratory. Regarding the experimental project you're participating in, it cannot be arbitrarily changed without the chief's agreement." Saul nodded. "I understand. Don't worry, I'm still more interested in mermaids for now." Alfonso across from him was quiet for 3 seconds. "Lord Saul, physical relations with mermaids are not recommended." Cough, cough, cough. Saul couldn't help but cough lightly, defending himself. "Lord Alfonso, I was just joking with Wizard Royer." Alfonso pressed his somewhat colorless lips together and nodded. "That's good then. I have trouble distinguishing between genuine intentions and jokes." Saul pressed his palms together. "Understood. I'll try not to joke in the future." Alfonso nodded with satisfaction, then stood up. Then let's go to the next place. Didn't you just say we were done for today? Saul followed him up in confusion. Where are we going? To see the mermaids you're interested in. Alfonso made a motion to snap his fingers. Relax, don't resist. Saul blinked. Snap. Both simultaneously left the closed, busy laboratory and appeared on a wooden boat. They were now in a dim, underground waterway. However, with Saul's vision and mental power, he could still see the moss covering the rocks on both sides and water, drops continuously dripping down. This cramped underground waterway had only one path for a long distance, looking like an artificially excavated tunnel rather than naturally formed. This is beneath the royal palace. In the darkness, Alfonso pulled in the iron chain that tethered their boat to a nearby stone pier. The chain made a clatter-clatter sound, with one end falling into the water with a plop. I can only teleport within a certain range of the royal palace. This is also an ability granted to me by the chief. Saul wasn't sure why Alfonso was telling him about his power limitations. Saul rolled his eyes, gripped the boat's edge with one hand, and sat honestly in the boat. Ha, now I believe you and Wizard Royer are very good friends. You remind me every time you teleport me, but you don't need to remind Royer. Obviously, you often throw him out, and he doesn't resist. Alfonso remained silent, not refuting. Although Saul didn't understand how these two had become friends, he wasn't very curious either. He sat in the boat, watching Alfonso lower a circular device. Then motor-like vibrations came from beneath the boat, and the entire vessel shot forward like an arrow from a bow. Alfonso touched his fingertip to the boat, and a layer of black mist appeared outside the hull. Whenever the boat hit rocks on either side due to its extreme speed, this black mist acted like a protective film, cushioning the impact and correcting direction. The narrow waterway suddenly opened up after a sharp descent. It seemed they had transitioned from an artificially excavated waterway into a natural river. The water flow here was more turbulent with undercurrents, making the boat bob occasionally. Stone pillars, occasionally breaking the surface, made navigation challenging. Fortunately, both people on the boat had reached a level where they didn't take such challenges seriously. They could still exchange interesting conversation against the background music of rushing sounds echoing through the cavern. The boat avoided blocking stone pillars with the help of the black mist, only needing to watch out for stalactites overhead. After traveling in this area for another half-hour, light finally streamed in from ahead. Saul could finally see with normal vision. Outside the cavern was an endless ocean. Waves sparkled, shattering the reflection of stars. Good weather for a night cruise. Saul looked left and right. Didn't you say the southeastern coast was covered with Red Sea trees? Why can't I see any? Since Evernight needed to cultivate and control mermaids, they couldn't possibly build the royal palace on the northwestern coastline. The tide is in. The Red Sea trees are all underwater now. Mermaids live at the Red Sea tree roots, but we're not going there today. Then where are we going? Some individuals have appeared among the mermaid population whose resistance to black tide pollution has weakened for unknown reasons. They've already shown serious pollution symptoms with contagious tendencies. To control the pollution situation, I've isolated all mermaids showing pollution symptoms separately on the shore. The boat changed direction and began traveling along the shore, still at high speed, seemingly reckless enough to throw both passengers overboard. Banged! After a few more minutes, the boat stopped by crashing into a large recessed rock. Thanks to the black mist's protection, the hull suffered no damage. Saul jumped down from the boat, stepping onto soft sand. Your driving skills need improvement, I'm serious. Alfonso didn't answer, only directing the boat's chain to automatically tie to a thick iron nail driven into a rock crevice. Then he also jumped out. It's just ahead. Saul followed Alfonso further, rounding a massive reef the size of a small house. Finally seeing a pool of water. The pool was very clear and very deep, with a terrifying sense of wanting to suck people in. Saul naturally wasn't afraid of being sucked in. He'd been to even deeper ocean floors. At that time, he'd even obtained a special oceanic rune, though aside from research, it hadn't been put to other uses. The mermaids are below. Saul stood at the pool's edge, letting waves wet his shoe soles. He sensed over a dozen weak mental fluctuations. Not the powerful fluctuations of wizards, but normal mental fluctuations even weaker than ordinary people. He looked at the pool's sides constantly swaying in the water. They're all hiding inside. Alfonso suddenly had brown fragments in his hand, which he threw into the pool. The originally clear pool immediately became murky. From the pool's depths, even deeper places where moonlight couldn't reach, mermaid after mermaid emerged. Water waves obscured their faces. Slender, graceful figures with fish tails swam upward in circles, creating a beautiful, heart-lifting scene. When they came closer, faces that were conical both above and below emerged, reality shattering the fantasy. After careful observation, Saul found that, although these mermaids looked strange with faces more like fish than humans, they were at least more normal than the mermaid Kate currently inhabited. They had seaweed-like dark green long hair, but didn't have 6 breasts. They looked somewhat more pleasing to the eye. Maybe that wizard in Sky City made private modifications when raising mermaids, modifying mammary organs. Could he have wanted private breeding? Just as Saul was comparing Kate with the mermaids before him, a flash of fiery red suddenly appeared, entering his vision. It was a unique female mermaid with red hair. When she swam, fine red strands bloomed in the water like a terrestrial rose. "Coral is here," Alfonso said softly, seemingly afraid his voice would frighten the timid mermaids in the pool. "She's an atavistic mermaid with appearance closer to the ancient Azure Scale clan." Chapter 816, Rotten Tail. After Alfonso's soft introduction, Coral underwater seemed to hear the sound and timidly looked up toward the surface. This also allowed Saul to clearly see her face obscured by red hair. He actually had the sensation of seeing the little mermaid from fairy tales. The mermaid named Coral had a narrower skull and jaw compared to ordinary humans, but could already be called an oval face. She possessed red pupils the same color as her hair, sparkling like rubies. However, before Saul could continue admiring the mermaid's appearance, she did a backward flip in the pool, revealing her lower body's tail. Saul immediately frowned. Half of Coral's fish tail was actually rotted away. Her tail was blue-green like a clear sky after rain, but with most of it missing, exposing tail bones and large amounts of rotted flesh that had turned white from soaking in water. There were also scattered pieces of flesh connected to the tail by thin strands of meat, looking like they could be torn off with a little force. The translucent tail fin clearly reflected colorful halos like a pearl, but was also full of gaps and in tatters. In short, it looked very painful. This is the black tide pollution you mentioned. Its surface characteristics don't quite match the black tide pollution I've seen before. Alfonso said seriously, "We've preliminarily ruled out the possibility of pollution caused by other substances. As long as they stay in seawater with black tide, the pollution worsens." If Alfonso wasn't lying, then this rotting could really be caused by black tide pollution. Well, black tide pollution has diverse manifestations. Maybe this is a newly appeared characteristic. Saul didn't speak definitively. "I've named this pollution disease rotten tail." Saul nodded, very descriptive. The first case of rotten tail disease was Coral. Because she's an atavistic mermaid, we pay relatively high attention to her. It might also be that because of the atavism, her tolerance to black tide pollution is lower than current mermaids. Fortunately, we discovered the symptoms in time and found their contagious nature, so we could isolate all diseased mermaids before a large-scale outbreak. Saul observed the other mermaids and found they also had rotting tails, but the most severely rotted was still Coral. "I'd like to take some of her diseased tissue." Alfonso didn't object. "You can, but be careful. These mermaids are very wary of wizards. If you frighten her, she might struggle very violently. She's the first patient, we can't let her die yet." "Don't worry, I've been a doctor for several years too." Saul took off his wizard robe and casually threw it on the sand behind him. Then he jumped into the water with a smooth entry that only created shallow ripples on the surface. Alfonso stood on shore with arms crossed, watching Saul's movements, somewhat dazed as if thinking of something. As Saul entered the water, the mermaids fighting for food immediately fled in panic toward rock crevices. But strangely, Coral, who should have equally feared humans, remained in place. Her gaze toward Saul even held a trace of curious affinity. When Saul approached, Coral actually swam toward him. At this distance, Saul keenly discovered that Coral's soul body was slightly stronger than other mermaids. Perhaps thanks to atavism, her intelligence was closer to a human child's. After Coral approached Saul, she extended both hands and grabbed one of his arms. "Is it because of Floco? Do I have remnants of Floco's mental power that make her feel close to me?" Saul boldly speculated. Water god Floco was from the Azure Scale clan, and Coral had undergone atavism, so she might be familiar with Floco's mental power. Saul extended his hand, transforming it into semi-transparent tentacles that covered Coral's half-rotted fish tail. Painlessly, Saul took several samples from Coral, wrapping them in tentacles and retracting them into his body. Because he didn't yet understand the pollution on Coral, Saul cautiously isolated the samples from his main body. After taking samples, Saul again swept over Coral's mental power. Looking at her ruby-like large eyes, he raised his hand to gently caress her cheek. Coral had tiny scales on both sides of her cheek that felt rough yet smooth to the touch. Coral closed her eyes like a little cat, almost ready to purr with enjoyment. Saul seriously examined Coral's body structure, then turned to the surface. Coral opened her eyes in confusion and even chased after Saul for several meters. Just then, she suddenly saw a small black tentacle emerge from Saul's nape. The tentacle tip opened, revealing a black tongue. Blub 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 blub. Little algae stuck out its tongue, bubbles emerging from its mouth. Coral widened her eyes and reached out to grab that black tentacle, but in her peripheral vision, she saw the gloomy man at the water surface not far away. Coral's movements paused. She shrank her shoulders as if very afraid, then flicked her tail and fled back to the pool's depths as if escaping. Saul didn't notice the commotion below, and could only sense that Coral had chased for a while before giving up. He climbed out of the clear, cold pool, used magic to clean excess water and dirt from his clothes, and put on the wizard robe he'd thrown aside. "How could Coral be so close to you?" Alfonso had been stunned for a while. As soon as Saul emerged from the water, he couldn't wait to ask. "Probably because I also have a mermaid nearby and she finds the aura familiar," Saul said casually. "Besides, as a doctor, I naturally need to know how to comfort patients." Alfonso looked thoughtful. "Could you teach me how to comfort mermaids?" "Do you also need to comfort mermaids? I thought the tribunal was used to solving problems with violence." "That's not violence, just necessary means," Alfonso retorted, but thinking of Saul's method of comforting mermaids, he rarely softened his tone. "I can trade my unique dark attribute magic with you." Saul stroked his chin. "I'll consider it." After seeing the mermaids, Alfonso's introductory work was finished for the day. The next contact would have to wait until Saul thoroughly understood the materials and samples he'd obtained from Alfonso. Otherwise, without knowing even basic theory, he couldn't conduct further research. Returning by the same route, Saul didn't need Alfonso to escort him back. He directly located Kate and teleported back to his palace. After returning to the palace, Saul didn't wander around. The tribunal's attitude toward him wasn't yet clear, so naturally he wouldn't roam about looking for trouble. After both Saul and Alfonso left, the cold moonlight continued to illuminate the beach as always. In the deep pool by the sea, red-haired Coral was swimming toward the pool's deepest part. Swimming to depths invisible to the naked eye. She suddenly turned and crashed into a rock. Then her entire body disappeared into it. There was actually a mechanism under this rock, not relying on magic, but using dyed seaweed and algae to disguise it as part of the rock. Unless patrolling wizards came down personally, mental power scans couldn't detect problems here. Behind the mechanism was a crevice only allowing one mermaid to pass through. Swimming up and out of the crevice, Coral came to a dim cave. She jumped out of the water surface and dragged her damaged fish tail toward another pool on the opposite side of the cave. "Sister, don't move, I'm coming over." A voice suddenly rang out in the cave, creating intermittent echoes. Coral's face suddenly showed lively anger, quiet. Her voice wasn't loud, but her expression was enough to convey the message. Another mermaid suddenly emerged from the pool opposite. It was a male mermaid. He looked almost exactly like Coral, except his hair and pupils were both blue-green, deep and beautiful like aquamarine. His name was also Aqua. Chapter 817, Aqua. Aqua and Coral were sibling mermaids, but Aqua was born with an automatic ability to conceal mental power, so he was hidden away from birth. Knowing his sister had difficulty moving due to her tail injury, Aqua climbed out of the pool himself and easily came to Coral's side using the slippery rocks. Looking at his sister's tail, he bit his lip in distress. "How much longer do you have to take that medicine?" Coral again pressed her hand over her brother's mouth. "Don't say it, don't ask. It has nothing to do with you." This wasn't the first time Coral had refused Aqua's concern. Aqua felt heartbroken and guilty, but also knew it was best if they didn't share what each was doing. Meeting here was actually very risky behavior for both. If the demon wizard Alfonso discovered them, they might not survive. It didn't matter if they couldn't survive, but this concerned the future of the mermaid race. They had to be cautious. This meeting only happened because Coral had sent a rare signal, so he dared swim up from the deep sea to this secret base to rendezvous with his sister. Suppressing the urgent desire to care about each other's circumstances, Coral began sharing her important discovery from today. "Today a wizard came with the demon. I detected a very familiar aura on him." Coral lowered her voice and said mysteriously to Aqua, "Familiar aura? What's familiar about us and wizards? They're all our enemies." Aqua wasn't interested in wizard affairs. Although their intelligence and soul bodies were much stronger than other mermaids due to atavistic mutation, that didn't mean he possessed equivalent wisdom. A mermaid who had been hidden at the ocean floor since birth, no matter how clever, lacked life experience. Coral again covered her brother's mouth to stop him from speaking, saying with a serious expression, "SHH, I suspect that new person is also a mermaid and possesses mermaid royal bloodline." Aqua widened his eyes. He wanted to laugh, but felt it wouldn't be good to mock his sister. How could a wizard possibly be a mermaid? Looking at his sister's damaged tail, his mood to laugh disappeared. "No matter what you suspect, don't do unnecessary things. The more you do, the more mistakes you make. I'll have Mr. Blackfish verify that new wizard. When the time comes, we'll rescue the princess." Aqua stopped halfway. He knew that although he hadn't said everything, Coral could understand his meaning. Although Coral wasn't very smart, the two had exceptional rapport. Coral indeed understood. She also instructed her brother, "If the time comes, do what you need to do. Don't tell me and don't worry about me." Aqua didn't respond. Every meeting Coral said not to worry about her, but Aqua had already decided that if there was even the slightest possibility, he would take his sister along. He wouldn't leave her alone to serve as a living garbage disposal with the modified mermaids. After their brief exchange, Aqua leaped back into the pool he'd come from, passed through the narrow waterway, and entered the deep sea. This was the coastal area. Even deeper seawater couldn't escape entanglement by Red Sea tree roots. But deep-sea roots were always sparser than near the surface. There were some invisible black particles in the seawater that would disappear like smoke and dust when touched. These were black tide pollution mixed in the seawater, something feared by wizards throughout the world. Aqua didn't know about the abyssal eye, but he felt that since the mermaid race could survive in pollution-filled seawater, it meant they were actually more suited to this world than humans or wizards. If they could seize the opportunity to escape wizard control and stop meaninglessly consuming their lives cleaning pollution for others, the mermaid race would definitely rise in the future. Just like the ancient Azure Scale clan. This knowledge was all taught to him by Mr. Blackfish. In Aqua's heart, Mr. Blackfish was mysterious in origin but the best person to them. He helped them survive in harsh environments and helped them find ways to escape wizard control. Mr. Blackfish also has a strong royal aura. Could that new wizard really be Mr. Blackfish? The more Aqua thought about it, the more shaken he became. If it's Mr. Blackfish, maybe he could disguise himself as a wizard. Should I ask next time I see him? Aqua gracefully swayed his fishtail in the water. 1/3 of his silver tail had blue-green scales. This was their greatest characteristic of reverting to the Azure Scale clan. Aqua's sister Coral actually had more blue-green scales on her tail, but she lacked Aqua's talent for concealing mental power, so she ultimately stood in front, shielding Aqua from all covetousness and scrutiny, even willing to contract that terrible pollution just to hide his existence. Aqua squinted. Mermaids had no tears, but that didn't mean they had no hearts. Passing through barriers deliberately woven from roots and complex underground crevices, Aqua came to a tranquil sea area. In this sea area, over 20 mermaids swam freely. Regardless of gender or appearance, they all shared one common characteristic. Their tails had more or less blue-green scales, like clear skies after rain. That was also the hope of their mermaid race. Nearly 10 days had passed since obtaining mermaid research materials from Alfonso. These days Saul had been holed up in his room reading books and conducting simple verifications on the mermaid Kate. Very efficiently. Today, he had finally read through most of the basic materials, so he took out the pollution samples obtained from the mermaid Coral, preparing to compare them with black tide pollution samples he'd collected before. Just then, the large water tank beside him suddenly splashed as the mermaid's tail flicked out, spraying water everywhere. Saul looked over and saw Kate had changed demeanor, leisurely leaning on the tank. He quickly looked around, then used magical power to create a barrier. "Don't worry, when I come out, I also watch whether the situation here is appropriate," Floco said with a smile. He enjoyed swaying his fish tail in the water. In Sky City, he couldn't even take a proper soak, only wooden buckets where turning over was difficult. Most importantly, he was no longer in mermaid form there. Although this mermaid body was terrible, it inexplicably made him nostalgic. Saul relaxed slightly. Since the water god said there was no problem and he hadn't detected anyone spying, it should be safe. "I thought you wouldn't come over again for a long time. After all, your situation there is more difficult than here." when Floco had transformed into a water spirit and fought fiercely with Ophelia. Although he retreated in time while in poor condition, it had triggered Ophelia's carpet search. So he was actually hiding quite miserably now, but he absolutely couldn't show it in front of Saul. I sensed you had contacted the aura of my descendant's bloodline, so I found an opportunity to come see. You've already met the mermaid race here. I've only seen a small part so far, Saul paused. Their current state is much worse than I previously imagined. Saul detailed what he had witnessed these past days and learned from books. Overall, the current mermaid race was like domesticated livestock, existing entirely for wizards' needs. Chapter 818, Fellow Sufferers. After listening to Saul's account, Floco closed his eyes. When he reopened them, he still appeared leisurely. His reaction was different from what Saul had expected. I thought you'd be angry after hearing this, or at least sigh. Floco waved his hand dismissively. When the Azure Scale clan left this world, the remaining mermaids were all mixed-blood branches with very low status. Even if I were still in this world, they wouldn't necessarily live better than now. Of course, they might have a better reputation on the surface. Floco was essentially the god of the Azure Scale clan. A god might care for his believers and subjects, but wouldn't concern himself with whether a particular group lived happily. Didn't you say this mermaid has your bloodline? Floco was blunt. Reproducing offspring is a basic need. Racial expansion is survival insurance. Saul didn't judge the other's lifestyle and took out the pollution sample obtained from the mermaid coral's tail. A piece of flesh and some blood. This is flesh and blood taken from a mermaid showing atavistic traits. Can you determine if it has your bloodline? Actually, there's mermaid royal bloodline with higher concentration, but I can't get that for now. The flesh was pale, but the blood was darker. Floco swept it with mental power and shook his head. Nothing to do with me. Should be bloodline from other Azure Scale clan members. He told Saul, this isn't important. Like I said, the mermaids left behind were all mixed bloodlines, not royalty from our era. The remaining mermaids probably elevated their own status. When there are no tigers in the mountains, monkeys rule as kings. Saul expressed understanding. Since they're not your descendants and you don't care, I won't hold back. Floco waved his hand. Do as you please. Saul raised the question he'd been contemplating these past days. Atavistic mermaids have stronger soul bodies than modified mermaids, but their adaptability to black tide pollution decreases as a result. Maybe we can understand what modifications the tribunal made to mermaids by comparison. The tribunal had fought black tide pollution for hundreds of years, possessing knowledge that even Saul's exceptional talents couldn't obtain. That's normal. The stronger the soul body, the more unstable it is, like how taller buildings are more likely to collapse. Saul nodded. So we need to reinforce our building materials. A well-built skyscraper was definitely more durable than a thatched hut. Looking at the clear-minded Floco before him, then thinking of Kate, and finally the originally ugly mermaid with only survival instincts, a light bulb went off in his mind. For the tribunal, the hardest part is actually controlling mermaids. Maybe they just tampered with the mermaids' soul bodies, then threw all mermaids into black tide pollution and selected survivors for mass breeding. Using natural mutation instead of artificial modification, if the sample size is large enough, that could indeed save a lot of time. Floco showed no emotion discussing this matter. Saul became somewhat worried again. But then there's no technical content to reference. Coral's pollution might just be caused by her strong but unstable soul body. But to solve the pollution, would we have to destroy her soul body? Thinking of that ruby-like mermaid, Saul felt somewhat reluctant. He thought, I still need to visit the Red Sea trees and large numbers of mermaids to compare the differences. If Alfonso won't take me, I can ask Wizard Royer for help. Yes. Wizard Alfonso, whom Saul was thinking about, was currently in the Evernight Royal Palace, in His Majesty the Emperor's quarters, watching Sander have his blood drawn. Two young female wizard apprentices knelt before Sander's knees, each holding one of his arms. Both apprentices' mouths had been specially modified, lips protruding, then gradually tapering into thin needle-like tubes. Their stomachs had also been modified into two chambers, one for consuming liquid food, another for storing Sander's blood. This large-scale blood drawing occurred once a month. Besides this, Sander had mandatory tasks to complete. Weekly breeding sessions. Although the court gave this activity a pleasant name, inheritance, Sander internally considered it breeding. The shame this word brought prevented Sander from quickly becoming numb and depraved like previous emperors. After the blood drawing, the two female wizard apprentices withdrew. Until their blood storage stomachs were removed, they couldn't eat again. Some were lucky and quickly underwent surgery, but others starved to death in the process. Sander's face turned 3 shades paler after the blood drawing. He leaned back against the soft leather cushions of his reclining chair, but the dizziness in his head didn't lessen. He closed his eyes but felt worse, so he forced himself to open them and look across the room. Opposite Sander was an enormous floor-to-ceiling glass wall. It was the adjacent room, a space enclosed by crystal glass. Inside the glass was clear seawater with clean stones and seaweed. This was a room made of water, also confining royalty. An heir to mermaid royal bloodline. Pearl. She was also an atavistic mermaid, the one with the purest bloodline among atavistic mermaids. She was born with a complete blue-green fishtail. She was called Pearl because she had pearl-white hair. When sunlight hit it, it reflected soft rainbow colors like real pearls. Alfonso had spotted her immediately among the mermaid population and used magic to extract her from the seawater. He discovered this uniquely beautiful little mermaid actually had a face resembling a human girl. From head to abdomen, she resembled a 17 or 18-year-old human girl with almost no mermaid racial features. Alfonso examined her body several times, always suspecting some illusion was affecting her. But after years of examination, he still found no traces of artificial manipulation. Pearl was truly born looking this way. However, mismatched with Pearl's extremely human aesthetic appearance was her damaged soul body. This had been personally verified by Tribunal Chief Frim. Pearl only had the intelligence of a 3 or 4-year-old child and couldn't speak. Alfonso still hadn't figured out why Pearl, who possessed the strongest mermaid royal bloodline, had a broken soul body. Due to her bloodline and special status, Alfonso kept her separately confined. For Sander, who was also under house arrest, Pearl was a fellow sufferer. In the glass water room opposite, Pearl also pressed against the wall watching Sander. Every time the Evernight Emperor had blood drawn, Pearl would press her rosy little mouth against the transparent wall, watching the spectacle with shock. She found it fascinating every time, even though she'd seen this scene hundreds of times. Sander forced a smile toward Pearl. Pearl immediately responded with a bigger, more brilliant smile. This improved Sander's mood somewhat. But his mood quickly soured again, because Alfonso appeared with a bottle of black potion. He thrust the black potion directly at Sander's face, blocking his view of the mermaid, and said in a low voice, "Drink it. Go back to sleep." Chapter 819, The Mermaid Princess. Facing Alfonso, Sander had no ability to resist. Whatever the other party told him to do, he had to do. If he showed protest, people would use magic to physically force him to act. It was better to obediently comply. Sander had just had blood drawn and had no strength left in his body. He struggled to extend his hand and take the potion Alfonso handed him. The black liquid sloshed in the bottle, occasionally forming strange shapes, as if the liquid itself was alive. Sander was already accustomed to taking this potion. Unlike his initial terror, he tilted his head back and poured the black liquid down his throat. Afterward, he tightly closed his mouth, his expression pained. Although he was used to this potion, that didn't mean he liked it. Especially after drinking it, the black liquid seemed like little people about to fall off a cliff, desperately clawing at his tongue coating and throat, not wanting to be swallowed. Sander felt so nauseous he wanted to vomit, but he couldn't drink water. He could only use physical methods to prevent himself from actually throwing up. Alfonso in front of him would definitely make him swallow back down whatever he vomited up. Finally, the struggle in his throat subsided. Sander exhaled, leaned back, covered in sweat as if he'd just been pulled from water. He tried to support himself to stand up, but his arm slipped down as soon as he pressed it against the armrest. Sander had fainted. Alfonso frowned slightly and was about to step forward when he sensed a familiar magical fluctuation. "Alfonso, I'm back again," Royer greeted Alphonse enthusiastically as always, as if he'd already forgotten who had thrown him into the fountain outside the palace a few days ago. "Why are you here?" As long as Royer didn't cause trouble, Alfonso wouldn't continue throwing people out. "The new bloodline fusion experiment has begun. I'm here to take away our noble His Majesty the Emperor." "Huh, already asleep." Royer tugged at Sander's arm and directly pulled him to the ground. Alfonso warned Royer, "I'm responsible for mermaids, you're responsible for Red Sea trees. We both need this Emperor, so you still need to protect him well." "Emperor, I'm afraid he won't be one much longer." "Until he isn't, he still is." Royer knew that when Alfonso got stubborn, he was extremely inflexible. Too lazy to argue with his friend, he obediently used a levitation spell to make Sander float in the air in a comfortable position and follow him. Before leaving, his peripheral vision glimpsed the mermaid in the glass room opposite, his eyes flashing with disgust and contempt. "You've been researching this mermaid princess for a while now, right? If there's no progress, why not give her to me to play with?" Alfonso looked down, cleaning the potion residue from his hands. "I'm still trying to extract the royal bloodline from her body. If I can extract it, the bloodline supply won't be critical." Royer pursed his lips. "Actually, if you ask me, there's no need for bloodline control methods. Just clear all food from the water and they'll only be able to eat tree roots. That would shorten the mermaids' lifespans." "So what if they're shortened? Just breed a few million and the total pollution cleanup volume would still increase. Modify them to be hermaphrodites, haha, self-producing and self-selling. Add several reproductive organs to improve efficiency." Alfonso wasn't tempted at all. "Your proposal would only exhaust their vitality, not very feasible." "Really?" Royer stroked his chin, still unwilling to give up. "Actually, someone recently proposed to the chief that we modify the mermaid race into shrimp. That way they could produce hundreds in a lifetime." "The chief won't agree to that." "How do you know the chief won't agree?" Royer patted Alfonso's shoulder. "In fact, the chief has already agreed. In a while, he'll hand over this most special mermaid princess to me for blood extraction." Alfonso suddenly looked up, his gaze sharp. "You want to steal my experimental project?" Royer laughed heartily and quickly patted Alfonso's back. "One broken mermaid isn't worth getting angry over. Given our 100 years of friendship, giving me one mermaid isn't too much, right?" After speaking, Royer stared intently at Alfonso. Only then did Alfonso withdraw his sharp gaze and brush away Royer's arm. "Anyway, without the chief's orders, I won't hand over this only mermaid royal to you. If you really want her, go request the chief's orders." Royer met with disappointment and shrugged. "Fine, fine, I'll go first then. I'll send this noble emperor back to you tonight." Alfonso was too lazy to even say farewell words and waved his hand to close the quarter's door. Afterward, he personally cleaned up the remaining experimental equipment without calling for wizard apprentices to help. The mermaid Pearl next door still pressed against the glass watching him, seeming curious about everything. After tidying up, Alfonso stood in place for a while, motionless as if powered down. Several more minutes passed before he came to his senses and walked to the glass wall, looking up at the mermaid who was making eye contact with him. "You have the highest bloodline concentration but won't speak. Is it that you don't like talking?" Pearl blinked, her milky white long hair slowly floating in the water. Colorful halos constantly shifted in Alfonso's eyes. He suddenly stepped forward into the glass wall. The hard wall made of crystal seemed like cheesecake before Alfonso, completely unable to block his steps. Alfonso entered the water-filled room, still looking up at Pearl. Pearl swayed her fishtail and approached Alfonso. She looked down, he looked up. Their lips touched briefly and separated. Pearl's eyes were bright, like a child who had eaten candy. Alfonso's eyes were sorrowful, like a beast trapped in a cage. So mermaid royal bloodline actually doesn't help improve mermaids' adaptability to black tide pollution. But this bloodline is an important power for controlling large groups of mermaids to obediently comply. Saul closed his book. Large numbers of mermaids live in areas under Red Sea trees. Using this method to control them is indeed efficient. If we follow Alfonso's approach of concentrating mermaids with royal bloodline in clean waters that are still close to the sea, we could also achieve control over mermaids. In that case, I could complete the task by simply treating the mermaids, but things might not be as simple as they appear. As Saul was thinking, someone suddenly knocked on the palace door. "Wizard Saul, I'm Royer. May I come in?" Saul immediately remembered that cheerful red-haired wizard. "Please come in." Saul stood up to welcome Wizard Royer, who was of the same rank. The door wasn't locked anyway. The other party knocking was just politeness. Royer pushed open the door and poked his head in, still wearing the smile Saul had seen at their last meeting. "Saul, may I call you that?" Saul didn't refuse. Royer continued, "I heard you've been cooped up in this palace for almost 10 days. I'll take you out for a walk to see Nefret's magnificent sights." Nefret Continent's magnificent sights must be the Red Sea tree forests. Saul's eyes lit up. He had been wanting to see the Red Sea trees. Not only to see the Red Sea trees, but Saul especially wanted to see the mermaids in the sea. Chapter 820, Beneath the Sea Surface. Royer couldn't teleport, and Saul had no coordinates outside the royal palace, so they honestly flew through the sky. Fortunately, third-rank wizards flew quite fast, and the Evernight Royal Palace was close to the coast. They soon saw the ocean. The last time Saul went to the seaside with Alfonso, he hadn't been able to see the Red Sea trees. This time the weather was clear and they happened to catch low tide. Looking out, the shoreline was a dazzling expanse of red. The red leaves resembled palms, densely overlapping together. Scattered dark brown tree trunks were exposed, their bark shining as if oiled. Dense Red Sea tree forest almost covered the entire coastal sea surface, and fallen leaves had dyed the nearby seawater red. Royer flew ahead and dove headfirst into the water beneath the trees. Saul followed closely, entering the water with graceful form. Swimming under the Red Sea trees was very difficult. The Red Sea, the name of this sea area below, wasn't as spacious as other waters. It was filled with tangled Red Sea tree roots, and they couldn't damage them. Fortunately, both men moved with agility and speed even underwater, as if they were soaring through the sky. Royer introduced the Red Sea trees to Saul along the way. These were his carefully cultivated children. Though he hadn't given birth to these children, He had definitely raised them. Red sea tree leaves absorb nutrients in the air, while the trunks are the important part for resisting pollution. The two continued descending, and the light grew increasingly dim. Although he knew Saul's vision wouldn't be greatly affected in this environment, Royer enthusiastically illuminated the nearby waters to show off. This is where Red Sea trees store pollution. Royer led Saul close to a tree root as thick as a thigh, where 4 or 5 head-sized tubers had formed. They resembled underwater sweet potatoes, but with relatively smooth surfaces. Royer casually crushed a tuber, revealing the dark brown pulp inside. Saul recalled that Alfonso had seemed to throw these things into the deep pool by the sea a few days ago, drawing out the sick mermaids hiding inside. Saul also took one, crushed half of it, and carefully examined the tuber's composition with his hands. He discovered low-activity black tide pollution hidden in the tuber's fibers. But after he crushed the tuber, the black tide pollution inside quickly returned to activity. Indeed, Red Sea trees could only absorb and store pollution, completely unable to process it. However, even so, their method of temporarily storing pollution from seawater in root tubers at least allowed coastal residents to live normally. Royer, Saul asked the other man who was watching him, "Do you know about Black Sea trees?" Royer wasn't at all surprised that Saul also knew of Black Sea trees' existence. Although the tribunal wouldn't openly station forces in the borderland, that didn't mean they knew nothing about happenings there. In fact, the former third-rank wizard of the borderland had been their biggest source of information. "Of course I know. I personally led the purge against the wizard family that advocated preserving Black Sea trees." Royer wore an arrogant, proud smile, as if he were bragging about saving an entire family rather than exterminating one. Saul couldn't help but glance at Royer. Third-rank wizards lived long lives. Many things that sounded like historical biography had actually happened to the person before him. Black Sea trees are more efficient at absorbing pollution and can even process pollution to some extent. Haven't you tried combining the advantages of Red Sea trees and Black Sea trees? Species hybridization, taking the best of both. Though difficult, it would be worth trying for Nefret's future. Royer's smile faded somewhat. "You think we haven't considered it? The key is that Black Sea trees and Red Sea trees are completely incompatible in several core characteristics. There's no way to make the two species combine. Even if Black Sea trees just appear, Red Sea trees will have their nutrients plundered and die in large numbers." Though Royer was arrogant and flamboyant, he was still serious about his experiments. To ensure Red Sea trees' pollution absorption efficiency, we don't dare let Black Sea trees appear in Nefret. If not for preserving species diversity for the future, we wouldn't even allow Black Sea tree to remain in the borderland. Royer suddenly stared at Saul. "The original keeper of the Black Sea tree, Justin, is already dead. Herbert, who killed him, also died by your hand. The only remaining Black Sea tree should be in your hands, right?" Saul tacitly agreed. Royer shrugged. This gesture was especially inconspicuous underwater. "If it's in your hands, so be it. As long as you don't bring it to Nefret, I won't lead a hunt for you." Saul looked frank. "I do know the story of Red Sea trees and Black Sea trees." Seeing Saul's sincere expression, Royer felt quite pleased and rarely mentioned mermaids. "Aren't you interested in mermaids? I'll take you to see them. Aside from feeding, they generally don't surface in shallow waters." He turned and swam toward the deeper ocean, where Red Sea tree roots gradually changed from dense to sparse, but never completely disappeared. Saul hurried to follow Royer, though his expression was somewhat stiff. Because he suddenly remembered that little algae living in the back of his neck had just devoured part of the essence of Black Sea trees and inverted trees. Due to time constraints, Saul hadn't yet tested what abilities little algae, which had tangled itself into a dead knot, now possessed. If little algae, having fused with black sea trees, also had the ability to make red sea trees kill themselves, would he also face endless pursuit from the tribunal? Saul's spine ran cold. He couldn't help but pat the back of his head, then press the back of his neck. Fortunately, although little algae had no brains, it was obedient. When told not to come out, it absolutely wouldn't. After instructing little algae, Saul relaxed slightly, regained his composure, and continued descending with Royer. Soon, Saul saw the mermaids living in the deep-sea area. Or rather, he couldn't call it living. It should be called barely surviving. In areas where the seabed intersected with tree roots lay large numbers of mermaids. They were all skin and bones, scales on their tails patchy and falling off, wounds covering their bodies. Some wounds were still bleeding, others had long since festered. If not for Red Sea trees and wizards' methods blocking seabed predators, these bloody scents would have attracted large numbers of carnivorous beasts long ago. The mermaid race was struggling to continue their existence in the comfortable environment deliberately created by wizards. Saul saw mermaids on the seabed, overlapping each other like autumn leaves that had fallen to the ground and piled together. No one would care about any individual leaf's feelings. It's winter now, so the seawater temperature is low. When spring comes, you can come see. Royer smiled with ill intent. Large-scale breeding scenes. Saul remained noncommittal. Whether he'd still be in Nefret in spring was uncertain, and even if he wasn't interested in such things. Royer stopped and didn't continue approaching the seabed, but Saul kept descending. Royer didn't stop him either. Because the bottom was covered with mermaids, Saul found a position, a rock covered with seaweed, to land on. But as soon as he landed, he realized something was wrong. Feedback from his mental power told him that what was covered by seaweed wasn't a rock, but a mermaid corpse that had died long ago. Saul was silent for a moment. Magical power spread outward from him, sweeping away all the mermaids lying nearby. This revealed the dense bones underneath. Mermaid skeletons that had died long ago.